Chapter 1. The Final Gambit. There are few moments in the long annals of Terra's history more pivotal than those final nights of the 31st millennium's waning years. The Emperor of mankind, he who had unified the cradle world through 3 centuries of bloody conquest, stood at the precipice of his greatest gambit. For millennia beyond counting, he had walked among humanity as guide, as guardian, as the hidden hand that steered civilization away from the abyss. Yet now, in the depths of the imperial palace, surrounded by the golden walls that had witnessed the birth of an empire, the master of mankind contemplated a path that would either save his species or damn it entirely. The great windows of the throne chamber looked out upon a Terra transformed. Where once had sprawled the techno-barbarian kingdoms and their endless wars, now stretched the gleaming spires of a unified world. The Thunder Warriors maintained their vigilant patrols through corridors that hummed with barely contained power, their gene-bulked frames casting long shadows in the eternal twilight of the palace depths. Yet for all the majesty of his achievement, for all the promise of the stars that beckoned beyond Terra's rebuilt atmosphere, the Emperor's mind dwelt not on triumph, but on the growing cancer that threatened to devour everything he had built. In the sealed chambers far beneath the palace foundations, 20 gestation pods pulsed with eldritch energies. Within each, a demigod took shape. His sons, the Primarchs, crafted from his own genetic template and imbued with fragments of his divine essence. They were to be the instruments of humanity's destiny, the generals who would lead his armies across the galaxy in the great crusade that would unite mankind beneath a single banner. Yet even now, as they grew within their artificial wombs, the Emperor could sense the hungry attention of entities that dwelt beyond the veil of reality. The Chaos Gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzinch, the triumvirate of ruin that had fed upon mortal emotion since the war in heaven 60 million years past. Their attention turned toward Terra with growing intensity, drawn by the psychic beacon of the developing Primarchs and the expanding scope of human ambition. The Emperor had hoped to starve them, to expand humanity's reach, while denying the dark gods the warfare, decay, and change upon which they fed. Yet with each passing year, as human civilization grew more complex and far-reaching, he understood with mounting dread that his strategy had failed. Malcador the Sigillite found his master in the hour of judgment, that liminal time between night and dawn when the palace lay shrouded in anticipatory silence. The ancient Psyker moved through the shadows with careful reverence, his staff clicking softly against the polished floors. He had served the Emperor for millennia, had stood witness to the rise and fall of nations, yet he had never seen his lord in such a state of profound contemplation. "My lord," Malcador spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Thunder Warriors report unusual warp fluctuations across the northern continents. The Psykers in the Scholastica Psychana speak of dreams filled with laughter and screaming." The Emperor did not turn from his vigil at the great window, though his golden armor seemed to pulse with inner fire at his advisor's words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of eons, the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of one who had watched civilizations bloom and wither like flowers in an endless garden. "They know, old friend. The ruinous powers sense what we build here. Each day that passes, each soul that joins the imperial dream, feeds their strength rather than diminishing it. The paradox I sought to avoid has come to pass." The Emperor's hands, clad in articulated plates of master-wrought auramite, clenched slowly at his sides. "In seeking to deny them sustenance, I have instead prepared a feast that will sustain them for eternity." Malcador stepped closer, his ancient features drawn with concern. In all their long association, through the unification wars and the careful reconstruction that followed, he had never heard such bleakness in his master's tone. "Then what would you have us do, my lord? The great crusade stands ready. The gene forges work night and day to create the legends Astartes. Your sons grow strong in their chambers. Surely we can proceed as planned and trust to your wisdom to see us through the trials ahead." The Emperor turned then, and Malcador took an involuntary step backward. The master of mankind's eyes burned with a terrible radiance, not the warm gold of a benevolent sun, but the harsh white fire of a star in its death throes. In that moment, the sigillite glimpsed the true depth of his lord's power, the barely contained force that dwelt within the immortal frame. "No, Malcador, I will not lead humanity into the darkness while feeding the very entities that seek its destruction. The time for half measures has passed." The Emperor moved to the great astrolabe that dominated the chamber's center, its bronze rings and crystalline matrices mapping the currents of the warp across the galaxy. With a gesture, he set the device spinning, its components aligning to show the roiling chaos of the imperium in all its terrible majesty. "I go to war not as a general, but as an executioner. The chaos gods have gorged themselves on mortal suffering for too long. It is time they learned what it means to face one who remembers the galaxy before their birth." The implications struck Malcador like a physical blow. "My lord, you speak of entering the warp directly. The risks are known to me." The Emperor's voice cut through his advisor's protests like a blade through silk. "I have walked the paths of the imperium since before the first human learned to make fire. I know its dangers, its seductions, its infinite capacity for corruption. But I also know its weaknesses, the points where reality grows thin and even gods may bleed." He gestured to the spinning astrolabe, where red points of light marked areas of particular instability. "Khorne rages in his brass citadel, drunk on the wars of 1,000 worlds. Nurgle tends his garden of rot, content in his eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Tzeentch weaves his schemes within crystalline labyrinth, believing himself beyond mortal reach. They have grown complacent in their power, secure in the belief that no material being could threaten them in their own realm." Malcador felt the temperature in the chamber drop, despite the warmth radiating from his master's form. "And if you fail, my lord, if they overcome you, or worse, corrupt you to their purpose?" The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he contemplated possibilities that stretched across the centuries. When he spoke again, his voice held the finality of a funeral bell. "Then humanity will have lost its greatest protector, and the galaxy will burn as it was always destined to burn. But if I succeed, if I can sever the bonds that tie these parasites to reality itself, then the Great Crusade will proceed unopposed. My sons will lead humanity to the stars without the whispers of damnation in their ears. The golden path I have sought for so long will finally lie open before us." The ancient psyker bowed his head, understanding at last the magnitude of what his lord proposed. Not a battle for territory or resources, but a war for the very soul of humanity itself. "What would you have me do while you wage this war beyond the veil?" "Guard the Primarchs, monitor their development, ensure that the gestation process continues uninterrupted. If the Chaos Gods realize what I intend, they may seek to strike at my sons while I am engaged in the warp. The Thunder Warriors are to maintain absolute security around the laboratories. No one enters without your direct authorization." The Emperor moved to a sealed vault set into the chamber's far wall, his palm pressing against sensors that read the unique pattern of his genetic signature. and prepare the terminus decree protocols. If I do not return within 1 solar year, you must assume I have failed, and act accordingly." The vault opened with a sound like distant thunder, revealing artifacts that predated human civilization. Weapons forged in the dark age of technology, psychic foci that hummed with barely contained power, relics that had been old when the first shamans walked the earth. The Emperor began selecting items with the careful precision of a surgeon choosing instruments, each one added to his arsenal after long consideration. "My lord," Malcador ventured, "perhaps there is another way. The Webway project shows promise. If we could complete the human section of the ancient Eldar network, would take millennia we do not have." The Emperor's interruption was gentle but final. The Chaos Gods grow stronger with each passing day. Every human birth, every death, every emotion felt across our expanding domain feeds their power. By the time the Webway could be completed, they would be strong enough to break through into reality itself. No, old friend, the die is cast. I go to war not as the Emperor of mankind, but as the last shaman of Terra, carrying the hopes of every human soul that has ever lived. He turned from the vault, now girded with artifacts of immeasurable power, and for a moment Malcador saw him not as the master of a galaxy-spanning civilization, but as the ancient guardian he had always been, the last defender, standing between humanity and the dark. "Gather the custodian guard. Have them escort me to the Sanctum Imperialis. What I do next must be witnessed, recorded, and remembered. Win or lose, let history know that the Emperor of mankind did not go gentle into that good night." His golden eyes met Malcador's ancient gaze one final time. The Great Crusade begins not with the conquest of stars, but with the death of gods. As the Emperor strode from the chamber, his footsteps echoing through the corridors of his palace, Malcador felt the weight of ages pressing upon his shoulders. In all his millennia of service, he had never seen his lord so resolved, so utterly committed to a course of action that would reshape the very foundations of reality. The war for humanity's soul was about to begin. Chapter 2. Into the Eye of Madness. The Sanctum Imperialis had witnessed many pivotal moments in the Emperor's long reign, but none more momentous than the ritual that began in the deepest hour before dawn. The chamber itself defied mortal comprehension. Walls of black stone inlaid with golden sigils that pulsed with their own inner light, vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch beyond the physical constraints of the palace above. Here, in this place, where reality grew thin and the barrier between the material and immaterial worlds was but a gossamer veil, the master of mankind prepared to cross a threshold from which there might be no return. The custodian guard stood in perfect silence around the chamber's perimeter, their auramite armor reflecting the eldritch radiance that began to emanate from their lord. These were the 10,000, the gene-forged guardians who had never known defeat, yet even they could not mask the tension that filled the sanctum like a living thing. They had followed the Emperor through the unification wars, had seen him shatter armies and topple tyrants. But this was different. This was not conquest of mere mortal realms, but war against the fundamental forces that shaped existence itself. Malcador stood at the great lectern, his ancient voice intoning protective wards in languages that predated human speech. The words of power resonated through the chamber, each syllable carefully crafted to maintain the barriers between worlds while allowing for controlled passage. His hands trembled, not with age, for the sigillite had transcended such mortal frailties long ago, but with the knowledge of what his master was about to attempt. In all the long millennia of their partnership, through the rise and fall of civilizations, he had never felt such foreboding. The Emperor stood at the chamber's heart within a circle of power that blazed with the intensity of a captured star. The artifacts he had gathered from the vault surrounded him like the points of a compass. The Apollonian spear that had slain the last of the dragon of Mars, the shard of Erebus that held a fragment of pure void, the crown of storms that commanded the fury of dying stars. Each relic hummed with barely contained energies, their combined power enough to crack the foundations of continents, yet they were but tools in the hands of one whose true strength lay not in weapons, but in will made manifest. "My lord," Malcador spoke, his voice cutting through the growing resonance of power, "the barriers are prepared. The return path is anchored. Yet I must ask one final time. Peace, old friend." The Emperor's voice carried new harmonics, as if spoken from a great distance, though he stood mere paces away. The golden radiance that had always surrounded him began to intensify, no longer the warm light of Terra's sun, but something far more primal and terrible. What must be done, shall be done. Guard well my body while my spirit walks paths that would drive lesser minds to madness. The transformation began with a sound like reality tearing. The Emperor's physical form remained standing within the circle, but something infinitely more vast began to separate from the golden shell of flesh and bone. His psychic projection took shape in the space above his body. Not the benevolent figure that had guided humanity for millennia, but a being of pure will and righteous fury. This was the Emperor as he truly was, the collective essence of 10,000 shamans, the accumulated power of humanity's greatest protectors, the living embodiment of mankind's refusal to surrender to the dark. The projection rose through layers of reality, like a golden comet ascending through the spheres of an ancient cosmology. Past the material realm with its comforting laws of physics, through the transitional spaces where thought began to take physical form, and finally into the roiling chaos of the imperium itself. Here was the realm of pure emotion and unbridled possibility, where the hopes and fears of every sentient being in the galaxy coalesced into impossible landscapes of dream and nightmare. The Emperor's arrival in the warp sent shockwaves through dimensions that had remained unchanged since the birth of consciousness itself. His presence blazed like a new sun in a realm of eternal twilight, its radiance burning away the accumulated filth of eons. Demons that had fed on mortal suffering since before mankind learned to make fire recoiled from the golden fire, their forms beginning to unravel in the face of absolute certainty made manifest. The first to answer his challenge were the lesser spawn of chaos, bloodletters eager for any battle, plague-bearers drawn to test their diseases against incorruptible flesh, horrors of Tzinch seeking to unravel his purpose with paradox and lies. They came in waves that would have drowned entire star systems, their numbers beyond counting, their hatred a palpable force that sought to drag him down into the mire of their existence. Yet the Emperor was not as they had expected. Where they had anticipated another mortal psyker, powerful perhaps but ultimately vulnerable to corruption and despair, they found instead an enemy that belonged to no single time or place. He fought not with the desperate fury of the living, but with the implacable certainty of natural law. His weapons were not blade or bolt, but concepts given form, justice that cut through deception, truth that banished illusion, hope that ignited like a flame in the darkness of despair. The lesser demons fell like wheat before the scythe, their essence scattered back to the raw stuff of the warp from whence they came. Yet even as thousands perished, thousands more took their place, drawn by the carnage and the unprecedented nature of their foe. The Emperor advanced through their ranks with terrible purpose, each step forward taking him deeper into the realm of his ancient enemies. It was then that Tzeentch took notice. The changer of ways, architect of fate, and master of the impossible, had been weaving his schemes in the crystal labyrinth that served as his seat of power when the golden radiance first blazed across the warp. At first, the Chaos God had dismissed it as another mortal foolish enough to project himself into the realm of the gods. Such presumption was not uncommon, and the feeding that followed was always particularly sweet. Yet as reports reached him from his demonic servants, as the impossible news of their systematic destruction filtered through the currents of the imperium, Tzeentch began to pay attention in earnest. This was no mortal psyker drunk on his own power. This was something else entirely, an entity that moved through the warp as if it belonged there, as if it had every right to challenge the supremacy of beings that had ruled unchallenged since the war in heaven. The first trap was elegantly conceived, a maze of crystalline passages that folded in upon themselves according to mathematical principles that existed only in the realm of pure thought. The Emperor would enter, seeking a direct path to his enemies, and find himself wandering forever through corridors that led nowhere, his strength slowly ebbing as he struggled against paradoxes that had no solution. It was a fate Tzeentch had prepared for countless enemies over the eons, and none had ever escaped. The Emperor entered the maze without hesitation, his golden radiance illuminating passages that stretched beyond the horizon of possibility. The walls shifted and changed around him, responding to his movements with malevolent intelligence. Passages that had been there moments before vanished into empty air, while new paths opened that led only to deeper confusion. The laws of geometry twisted themselves into knots, creating spaces that were simultaneously vast and confined, near and distant, real and illusory. Yet the Emperor did not wander. Where other minds would have been snared by the impossibility of navigation, he imposed his own logic upon the chaos around him. His will became a compass that pointed not to magnetic north, but to absolute truth. The maze writhed and buckled as it found itself constrained by laws more fundamental than its own chaotic nature. Passages that had never existed began to stabilize. Distances that had been malleable suddenly became fixed. The impossible became merely improbable, and the improbable became inevitable. Tzeentch felt the maze collapse with something approaching mortal shock. For the first time in 60 million years, one of his grand designs had been not merely circumvented, but utterly refuted. The implications sent ripples of concern through the crystal labyrinth. If this being could impose order upon chaos itself, then the foundations of Tzeentch's power might not be as secure as he had believed. The Emperor emerged from the shattered remains of the maze to find himself facing the first demon world of Tzeentch's domain. It was a place of impossible beauty and terrible knowledge, where the secrets of creation were written in flames across impossible skies. Libraries that contained every book that had ever been, or ever could be, stretched across landscapes that defied perspective. Rivers of liquid inspiration flowed through valleys carved from crystallized possibility. It was the sum total of intellectual achievement across the galaxy, perverted and twisted to serve the purposes of the changer of ways. The destruction began with a single word of unbinding. The Emperor spoke it in the tongue of pure concept, and reality shuddered in response. The flames that wrote forbidden knowledge across the sky guttered and died. The impossible libraries began to collapse as their foundations proved to be built not on truth, but on lies wearing the mask of wisdom. The rivers of inspiration boiled away, revealing the corruption that had always lurked beneath their surface. Across the galaxy, in the material realm, psychers screamed as they felt the disturbance in the warp. On Terra, in the deepest chambers of the palace, the nascent primarchs stirred in their gestation pods as the psychic storms that had always surrounded them began to calm. In the throne room of the Sanctum Imperialis, the Emperor's physical form remained motionless, but sweat beaded upon his golden brow as he fought battles that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. The demon world died with a sound like reality weeping. Its destruction sent shockwaves through the imperium that reached the brass citadel of Khorne and the plague gardens of Nurgle. For the first time since their birth, the Chaos Gods felt something they had thought themselves beyond: uncertainty. This was not the probe of a curious mortal or the desperate gambit of a dying civilization. This was something else entirely. This was war. The Emperor stood amid the ruins of Tzeentch's first domain, his golden radiance undimmed by the battles he had fought. Around him, the very substance of the warp began to stabilize, taking on the characteristics of ordered space rather than chaotic potential. Where once had reigned the arbitrary malevolence of the dark gods, now spread zones of calm certainty. It was a taste of what the galaxy might become if his gambit succeeded. A warp tamed and made safe for mortal travel, a realm where thought and dream could exist without corruption. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The true battles lay ahead, against enemies who had ruled unchallenged for 60 million years. They would not surrender their dominion easily, nor would they make the same mistake twice. The war for the soul of the galaxy had truly begun, and only one side could emerge victorious. In the crystal labyrinth that served as his fortress, Tzeentch began to plan in earnest. The game had changed, and new strategies would be required. But the changer of ways had not survived the birth and death of galaxies by failing to adapt. If this golden enemy thought to challenge the gods in their own realm, then he would learn what it truly meant to play against beings for whom victory and defeat were merely different faces of the same eternal dance. The Emperor began his advance toward the next daemon world, and the warp trembled before him. Chapter 3. The Brass Citadel Falls. The approach to Khorne's domain was heralded not by the gentle currents that marked most regions of the warp, but by a tide of rage so pure and absolute that it had taken physical form. Rivers of boiling blood carved channels through landscapes of brass and bone, while the screams of the eternally violent echoed across battlefields that stretched beyond the horizons of possibility. This was the realm of the blood god, where the fury of every war ever fought had crystallized into a monument to martial excess. The Emperor advanced through the killing fields with purpose that cut through the ambient rage like a blade through silk. Where lesser beings would have been overwhelmed by the sheer psychic weight of accumulated violence, he moved with the certainty of one who had witnessed the birth of warfare itself. The bloodletters that threw themselves at him died not in the frenzied melee they craved, but with surgical precision that left their essence scattered to the howling winds. This was not the mindless slaughter that fed their god, but something far more dangerous, war waged with perfect control and absolute purpose. The brass citadel rose from the heart of the killing fields like a jagged mountain of metal and malice. Its walls were forged from the weapons of every warrior who had ever fallen in battle, their bronze surfaces etched with the names of the slain in scripts that shifted and changed with each viewing. Towers of skulls spiraled into the blood-red sky, each one a monument to some forgotten conflict, while bridges of bone connected battlements that defied conventional architecture. At its heart, accessible only through an endless gauntlet of combat, stood the Skull Throne, the seat of power from which Khorne had ruled the domain of war for 60 million years. The Emperor's assault began not with stealth or cunning, but with a declaration that echoed through every realm of the Imperium. His voice, when it came, carried the authority of every general who had ever led troops into battle, every warrior who had fought for something greater than himself, every defender who had stood against overwhelming odds. It was the sound of righteous war made manifest. "Khorne!" The name thundered through the brass citadel with the force of a siege engine. "I am the Emperor of mankind, last of the shamans, master of terror, and I have come to end your reign of blood." The response was immediate and apocalyptic. From every tower, every battlement, every hidden redoubt, the demon legions of the blood god poured forth in numbers that would have drowned entire sectors. Bloodthirsters spread their brass wings and dove from the highest spires, their whips of flame trailing behind them like comets of destruction. Fleshhounds bayed as they charged across bridges of bone, their metallic howls promising death to any who dared challenge their master's supremacy. Bloodletters marched in perfect formation, their hellblades glowing with anticipation of the slaughter to come. Yet the Emperor did not meet them with the desperate fury they expected. Instead, he became something far more terrible, the perfect expression of controlled violence. His movements were economical, each gesture calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. The Apollonian spear that he wielded became an instrument of surgical precision, its point finding the exact weakness in each daemon's defenses that would send them screaming back to the void from whence they came. The battle raged across 7 levels of the citadel's outer defenses. Each one claimed a terrible cost in demon essence. The Emperor's golden radiance blazed brighter with each victory, fed not by the mindless bloodshed that sustained the realm around him, but by the righteous purpose that drove his advance. He was not killing for the joy of killing, but fighting for the survival of every human soul that had ever lived or would ever be born. The distinction proved crucial, for it allowed him to draw strength from the very violence he employed, while denying that same sustenance to his enemies. On the 7th day of the siege, Khorne himself emerged from the depths of his citadel. The blood god was terrible to behold, a being of such concentrated rage and martial fury that reality itself recoiled from his presence. He stood 3 times the height of a mortal man, his brass armor flowing like liquid metal across a frame built from crystallized violence. In his hands, he carried weapons that had been forged from the first act of murder ever committed, blades that had tasted the blood of gods and found it sweet. So, Khorne's voice was the sound of armies clashing, of metal ringing on metal, of the last breath of dying warriors. The little shaman thinks to challenge a god in his own domain. I have feasted on the rage of mortals since before your species learned to make fire, and you dare to bring your pretensions to my throne? The Emperor did not answer with words. Instead, he moved, and in that movement was the culmination of 10,000 years of martial training, the combined skill of every warrior shaman who had ever lived, the perfect expression of controlled violence made manifest. The Apollonian spear met Khorne's demon blade with a sound that shattered the brass foundations of the citadel itself. The duel that followed transcended the boundaries of single combat and became something approaching natural catastrophe. They fought across the citadel's battlements, their conflict sending shockwaves through dimensions that had remained stable since the birth of the galaxy. When Khorne's blade struck sparks from the Emperor's armor, those sparks became falling stars that ignited new wars on a dozen worlds. When the Emperor's spear drew blood from the god of war, that blood became rivers of liquid fire that carved new channels through the realm of battle. Yet as the combat progressed, something unprecedented began to occur. Khorne, who had never known defeat in combat, found himself being slowly, inexorably pushed back. The Emperor fought not with the frenzied bloodlust that the blood god expected, but with a discipline that transformed rage into something approaching art. Every blow was calculated, every movement part of a larger strategy that Khorne's primal fury couldn't comprehend. "Impossible!" the blood god roared as the Emperor's spear found a gap in his defenses, sending brass mail scattering like fallen leaves. "I am war incarnate. I am the fury of every warrior who has ever drawn blade. You are nothing but flesh and bone." "No," the Emperor replied, his voice calm despite the cosmic forces arrayed against him. "You are what war becomes when it loses sight of purpose. I am what war can be when it serves something greater than itself." The distinction proved more than philosophical. As their battle raged on, the very nature of the realm around them began to change. The mindless slaughter that had characterized Khorne's domain gave way to something more structured, more purposeful. The demon legions that had fought without thought or strategy suddenly found themselves moving in formation, their attacks coordinated rather than chaotic. It was as if the Emperor's presence was imposing order upon chaos itself, transforming the nature of conflict from mindless violence to controlled purpose. Khorne felt his power waning as the change spread through his realm. The blood god's strength had always come from the raw emotion of uncontrolled rage, the fury that drove beings to kill without thought or reason. But the Emperor was showing that martial prowess could exist without madness, that strength could serve something greater than itself. The philosophical victory became a literal one as Khorne's massive form began to diminish, his brass armor losing its unholy luster. The final moment came atop the skull throne itself, that monument to meaningless death that had served as the blood god's seat of power for 60 million years. Khorne made his last stand there, surrounded by the skulls of every warrior who had ever fallen in his name. Yet even that vast accumulation of death could not sustain him against an enemy who had redefined the very nature of battle itself. The Emperor's spear found its mark at last, piercing the brass breastplate that had never before been breached by mortal weapon. Yet the wound that killed the blood god was not made of metal or energy, but of concept made manifest. It was the idea that war could serve life rather than death, that violence could preserve rather than destroy, that strength could protect the weak rather than devour them. Khorne's death scream echoed through every realm of existence. It was the sound of every senseless battle that would now never be fought, every pointless death that would now never occur, every act of mindless violence that would now find itself tempered by wisdom. The blood god's dissolution was not violent but strangely peaceful, like a fever finally breaking after a long illness. The effects rippled outward from the brass citadel in waves that touched every corner of the galaxy. On Terra, in the laboratories deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the nascent Primarchs stirred in their gestation pods as the genetic templates within them found themselves freed from the whispers of martial excess. The violent tendencies that had been written into their very DNA began to moderate, their potential for leadership flowering as their capacity for mindless rage withered. Across the breadth of human space, the Thunder Warriors felt the change like a weight lifting from their shoulders. The gene-crafted berserkers who had conquered terror through brutal efficiency found their constant anger cooling to something more manageable. For the first time since their creation, they could envision a future that did not end in glorious death, but in purposeful service. Their genetic instability remained, but the psychological compulsions that had driven them to seek ever greater violence began to fade. In the warp itself, the demon legions of Khorne began their slow dissolution. Bloodthirsters who had terrorized the galaxy since the war in heaven felt their essence unraveling as the source of their power vanished from existence. The endless battles that had raged through the realm of war fell silent as their participants simply ceased to be. Where once had stood the brass citadel, now spread an empty plain under skies that no longer burned with the light of eternal conflict. The Emperor stood alone amid the ruins of what had been Khorne's throne, his golden armor unmarked despite the cosmic battle he had just fought. In his hand, the Apollonian spear pulsed with new power, not the crude strength of accumulated violence, but the refined authority of purpose made manifest. Around him, the warp itself began to stabilize, taking on the characteristics of ordered space rather than chaotic emotion. Yet he took no satisfaction from his victory. The death of Khorne had proven that the Chaos Gods could indeed be slain, but it had also revealed the magnitude of the task that still lay ahead. 2 gods remained, each as ancient and powerful as the one he had just destroyed. Nurgle tended his garden of entropy, while Tzeentch wove his schemes in the crystal labyrinth. Both would have learned from Khorne's defeat, and neither would make the same mistakes. But for the first time in 60 million years, war had been transformed from an end in itself to a means of achieving something greater. The Blood God was dead, and with his passing, the galaxy had taken its first step toward a future where conflict served life rather than death. It was a small victory in a war that would reshape the foundations of reality itself, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Emperor began his advance toward the next battlefield, and the warp trembled with possibility. Chapter 4. The Garden of Entropy. The transition from Khorne's brass citadel to Nurgle's domain was marked not by violence, but by a creeping sense of inevitability that settled upon the soul like autumn fog. Where the Blood God's realm had blazed with the fury of eternal conflict, the Plague God's garden whispered of gentler endings, the slow decay that claimed all things, the rot that fed new life, the patient entropy that reduced empires to dust and dust to possibility. It was, in its own diseased way, almost beautiful. The Emperor's golden radiance dimmed as he entered the outer reaches of Nurgle's territory, not through any loss of power, but in deference to the strange peace that permeated this realm of endings. Here was decay without malice, death without anger, simply the natural conclusion of all things that had ever lived. Ancient trees stood in eternal autumn, their leaves falling endlessly, yet never diminishing, while rivers of liquid time carried the detritus of countless civilizations toward seas that had no shores. The garden proper stretched beyond the horizons of comprehension, a vast expanse where every disease that had ever afflicted thinking beings grew in carefully tended plots. Plagues that had toppled star-spanning civilizations bloomed here as delicate flowers, their petals formed from crystallized suffering. Viruses that had ended species grew like mighty oaks, their branches heavy with the fruit of extinction. It was a taxonomy of endings, catalogued with the loving care of a gardener who saw beauty in every form of decay. Yet as the emperor walked among these monuments to mortality, the diseases that should have ravaged his form simply withered and died. His presence was anathema to decay, not through violent rejection, but through the simple fact of his nature as humanity's eternal guardian. Where his feet touched the diseased soil, new growth sprouted. Not the corrupted abundance of Nurgle's garden, but clean, healthy life that owed nothing to decay for its sustenance. The plague-bearers that tended the garden watched his passage with something approaching curiosity rather than hostility. These were not the frenzied warriors of Khorne's domain, but patient servants who had found purpose in the slow work of cultivation. They made no move to stop him, for they understood that all things came eventually to their master's garden. Even gods could not escape the final entropy that claimed everything. It was in the heart of the garden, where the greatest plagues of history grew in a greenhouse built from the crystallized breath of dying stars, that Nurgle finally appeared. The plague god was both more and less terrible than his brothers, a figure of such overwhelming fecundity that life itself seemed to pour from his every gesture, yet life so perverted and diseased that it bore no resemblance to anything wholesome or clean. "Welcome, Golden One." Nurgle's voice was the sound of fertile soil, of autumn leaves returning to earth, of the gentle sighs of the peacefully dying. There was no anger in it, only a profound sadness tinged with genuine affection. "I have watched your progress through my brother's domains with great interest. Such fury in the brass citadel, such determination against impossible odds. Yet you come to my garden not as a conqueror, but as one who seeks to understand." The emperor paused in his advance, the Apollonian spear lowered but not sheathed. For the first time since beginning his war against the Chaos Gods, he faced an enemy who did not rage or scheme, but simply waited with infinite patience for the conversation to begin. "I come to end you, Nurgle, as I ended Khorne. The cycle of decay and renewal you represent has become perverted beyond recognition. Where once you might have served the natural order, now you prolong suffering for its own sake, trap souls in eternal torment, and spread disease not to clear the way for new growth, but to feed your own power." Nurgle nodded slowly, his massive frame settling onto a throne grown from the remains of every plague ship that had ever carried death between the stars. Around him, the garden continued its patient work, flowers of disease blooming and withering in cycles that had repeated for 60 million years. Yet without me, Golden One, what becomes of renewal itself? I am not merely decay, but the force that breaks down the old so that the new may flourish. Every forest fire that clears dead wood, every death that feeds the soil, every ending that becomes a beginning, these are my gifts to the galaxy. Would you see creation itself become static, trapped forever in a single moment of supposed perfection? The philosophical challenge struck deeper than any blade. The Emperor had come prepared to fight disease and corruption, but found himself facing a more fundamental question about the nature of existence itself. In the garden around him, he could see the truth of Nurgle's words, the endless cycle of growth and decay that had driven evolution since the first organic molecules learned to replicate themselves in the primordial seas of countless worlds. "Renewal, yes," the Emperor replied at last, his voice carrying the weight of eons spent guiding humanity through the cycles of history. But controlled renewal, directed toward purpose rather than left to chance. You speak of forest fires, yet you have become the fire that burns without end, consuming not to cleanse, but to feed your own appetite for entropy. The galaxy groans under plagues that serve no purpose but to multiply, diseases that trap their victims in eternal suffering, rather than granting the mercy of quick death. "And what would you put in my place?" Nurgle asked, genuine curiosity coloring his diseased features. "Your own vision of controlled evolution, perhaps? Humanity shepherding the galaxy toward some predetermined destiny, pruning away whatever does not fit your grand design. How is that different from what I do here in my garden, tending each plague with loving care until it reaches its full potential?" The Emperor's response came not in words, but in action. He raised the Apollonian spear and spoke a word of unbinding that had been old when the first stars learned to burn. The greenhouse around them shuddered as reality reasserted itself, the crystallized breath of dying stars cracking under the pressure of absolute certainty made manifest. "The difference," the Emperor said as he began his advance, "is consent. I guide humanity toward greatness, but I do not force that guidance upon them. They choose to follow, choose to strive, choose to become more than they were. Your gifts are imposed without choice. Your blessings are curses that cannot be refused. That is the corruption at the heart of your nature. You have forgotten that true growth requires the freedom to choose." The battle that followed was unlike the furious combat that had claimed Khorne's realm. Here, the Emperor moved with surgical precision through gardens of disease, his spear cutting away cancers of the soul with the careful attention of a physician excising tumors. Each plague he touched withered not with violence, but with the simple presence of clean, purposeful life, existence that had chosen its own direction rather than being shaped by random mutation and uncontrolled growth. Nurgle fought back not with rage, but with sorrow, his attacks taking the form of diseases that whispered of loss, of entropy, of the inevitability of endings. He conjured plagues of despair that should have broken the Emperor's will, viruses of futility that should have made his quest seem meaningless against the vast indifference of the cosmos. Yet the master of mankind walked through them all untouched, his purpose serving as an immune system against hopelessness itself. "You do not understand," Nurgle pleaded, as the Emperor's advance brought him closer to the throne of decay. "Without me, without the cycle I represent, the galaxy will stagnate. Life will lose its meaning when death no longer gives it urgency. Love will become hollow when loss no longer makes it precious. You seek to create paradise, but paradise is only paradise because we remember the pain of its absence." "Perhaps," the Emperor acknowledged as his spear found its mark in Nurgle's diseased heart. "But I would rather see humanity face the risks of stagnation through their own choices than watch them suffer under entropy they never chose to embrace." The plague god's death was neither violent nor peaceful. It was simply an ending. His massive form began to dissolve, not into component parts, but into the fundamental concepts from which he had been formed, the careful balance of growth and decay that had defined his nature for 60 million years finally tilted toward dissolution, and with that tipping, the garden around him began to change. The effects rippled outward through the galaxy, with the slow inevitability that had always characterized Nurgle's works. On worlds where plagues had raged for millennia, the diseases simply stopped spreading, not cured, but no longer growing, no longer seeking new hosts with the hungry intelligence that had marked them as unnatural. The elderly began to live longer, their bodies freed from the accelerated decay that had claimed so many before their time. Yet the changes brought complications that the Emperor had foreseen but not fully prepared for. On agricultural worlds, the careful balance of pest and crop that had sustained ecosystems for thousands of years began to shift. Without the diseases that had controlled population growth among certain species, ecological imbalances began to emerge. The natural cycles of forest fires and seasonal die-offs that had cleared the way for new growth became disrupted, leading to overgrowth in some regions and unexpected barrenness in others. On Terra itself, in the laboratories beneath the imperial palace, the Primarchs stirred in their gestation pods, as yet another aspect of their genetic programming found itself freed from chaos influence. The elements of their design that had been intended to give them resistance to disease and accelerated healing began to stabilize, no longer fluctuating between extremes of vulnerability and invulnerability. Yet the techs monitoring their development noted with some concern that certain beneficial aspects of cellular renewal had also slowed. The Primarchs would be longer lived and more stable, but perhaps not quite as capable of rapid adaptation as originally intended. The Thunder Warriors felt the change differently. For many of them, the constant genetic degradation that had marked their existence since creation began to slow, their bodies finally finding a temporary equilibrium between enhancement and decay. Yet others discovered that the careful balance of hormones and stimulants that had kept their augmented systems functioning had been disrupted, leaving them weaker than before, but also strangely more at peace. In the warp itself, the vast garden that had been Nurgle's domain began its own transformation. The diseased plants that had grown there for eons did not simply die. They changed, becoming something new and unprecedented. Where once had bloomed the roses of consumption and the orchids of plague, now grew flowers that had no names, plants that represented not decay and renewal, but evolution guided by conscious choice rather than random chance. The Emperor stood alone in what had once been the greenhouse at the garden's heart, surrounded by the crystalline remains of Nurgle's throne. In his hand, the Apollonian spear pulsed with new understanding, not just the controlled violence that had served him against Khorne, but the more subtle power of guided change. Around him, the transformed garden whispered of possibilities both wonderful and terrifying, a universe where entropy served conscious purpose rather than blind chance. Yet he felt no satisfaction at this victory, for he understood better than most the complexity of what he had accomplished. Nurgle's death had indeed freed the galaxy from the grip of uncontrolled decay, but it had also removed a force that had, despite its corruption, served certain necessary functions. The balance that would replace it would have to be carefully maintained, requiring constant vigilance to prevent the very stagnation that Nurgle had warned against. Two gods remained, Tzeentch in his crystal labyrinth, and the still sleeping Slaanesh in whatever realm the youngest of the Chaos gods had claimed. Both would have learned from the fate of their brothers, and both would be preparing defenses that took into account the unprecedented nature of the threat they faced. The Emperor began his advance toward the next battlefield, carrying with him the weight of a victory that had proven far more complex than he had anticipated. In saving the galaxy from the corruption of decay, he had also assumed responsibility for ensuring that growth and change continued to serve life rather than merely prolonging it. It was a burden that would shape every decision he made in the battles yet to come. Behind him, the transformed garden continued its quiet work of becoming something new. Not the diseased growth that had characterized Nurgle's reign, nor the sterile perfection that some might have preferred, but the careful cultivation of life guided by wisdom rather than chance. It was perhaps the closest thing to hope that the warp had seen in 60 million years. Chapter 5. The Crystal Labyrinth Shatters. The path from Nurgle's transformed garden to Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth was marked not by physical distance, but by the gradual unraveling of causality itself. Where the plague god's realm had whispered of endings, and the blood god's domain had roared with violence, the architect of fate's territory existed in a state of perpetual becoming, a place where every possibility existed simultaneously, until observation collapsed the wave function of reality into a single, temporary truth. The Emperor's approach was heralded by disturbances in the fundamental structure of the warp. Paradoxes that had remained stable for millennia began to resolve themselves in his presence, their impossible contradictions smoothed away by the simple fact of his absolute certainty. Tzeentch's servants, the horrors of change, and the crystalline demons that fed on transformation, found themselves caught in feedback loops of causality, their nature as beings of pure change, grinding to a halt when confronted with something that simply refused to be altered. The labyrinth itself defied comprehension, even by the standards of the imperium. Its walls were constructed from crystallized possibility, each surface reflecting not what was, but what might be. Corridors branched into infinite permutations, leading to destinations that existed only in potential until someone chose to walk their length. The very act of navigation changed the maze around the navigator, creating new paths while destroying others in an endless dance of transformation that had entertained the changer of ways for 60 million years. Yet the Emperor did not navigate the labyrinth. He conquered it, where Tzeentch's trap relied on the uncertainty of choice to create infinite possibility. The master of mankind brought absolute certainty. His path through the maze was not chosen, but declared, imposed upon reality through will so focused that it left no room for alternatives. Behind him, the crystalline passages stabilized into fixed forms, their endless shifting frozen into singular configurations that would remain unchanged for as long as his purpose endured. At the labyrinth's heart lay the impossible fortress, Tzeentch's seat of power that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously while occupying no space at all. Here was where the architect of fate wove the great schemes that toppled civilizations and elevated others, where every plot and counterplot in the galaxy's history had been planned and set in motion. The fortress was a monument to change itself, its architecture constantly shifting between forms that had never been and shapes that could never be. Tzeentch awaited him there, not on a throne, but suspended in a nexus of pure possibility that kept the Chaos God in a state of perpetual transformation. One moment he appeared as a great bird of prey, with wings of living flame, the next as a sage whose robes were woven from the threads of fate itself. His appearance changed with every heartbeat, every thought, every quantum fluctuation of reality, for the changer of ways was change itself, the living embodiment of transformation in all its myriad forms. "Ah, the Golden One arrives at last," Tzeentch spoke, his voice echoing from every possible timeline simultaneously. "I have watched your progress through my brother's domains with great interest. Such certainty, such focus, qualities I have always admired, even as I sought to undermine them. Tell me, son of shamans, do you truly believe that order can triumph over change itself?" The Emperor did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the constantly shifting form of his enemy, noting the patterns that underlay even the most chaotic transformations. Where Khorne had been straightforward in his fury and Nurgle patient in his decay, Tzeentch represented something far more subtle and dangerous, the corruption of possibility itself, the perversion of growth and change into endless, meaningless complexity. "Change, yes," the Emperor replied at last, his voice cutting through the cacophony of potential that surrounded them. "But change with purpose, transformation that serves a greater design. You have become drunk on possibility itself, creating change for its own sake, rather than to achieve anything meaningful. You are no longer the architect of fate. You are the enemy of destiny itself. Tzeentch laughed, and the sound was the crystalline chiming of infinite futures colliding. Around them, the impossible fortress began to shift more rapidly, its walls displaying visions of what the galaxy might become. The Emperor saw humanity's future spreading across the stars in configurations he had never imagined, some glorious beyond his wildest dreams, others so terrible that they made the current age seem like paradise by comparison. Behold the possibilities. Tzeentch gestured to the swirling visions. In one timeline, your great crusade succeeds completely, and humanity rules a galaxy of perfect order, static, sterile, and ultimately dying from lack of challenge. In another, your sons rebel against you, and the galaxy burns in civil war. In a third, alien threats from beyond the galactic edge consume everything you have built. Which of these futures would you choose, knowing that your choice will doom countless billions to suffering you might have prevented? The visions intensified, showing the Emperor every permutation of victory and defeat, every path that might lead from his current actions to their ultimate consequences. He saw versions of himself that succeeded too well and became tyrants, others that failed and left humanity defenseless, still others that achieved perfect balance only to watch it collapse under the weight of unforeseen circumstances. It was the ultimate expression of Tzeentch's power, not physical might, but the paralysis that came from seeing too many possibilities at once. Yet the Emperor's response was not paralysis, but action. He raised the Apollonian spear and spoke a word that had no meaning in any language that had ever been or ever would be. It was the sound of absolute certainty made manifest, the declaration that among all the infinite possibilities arrayed before him, he would choose his own path and make it real through force of will alone. The crystalline visions shattered like glass struck by lightning. The impossible fortress convulsed as its 17 dimensions collapsed into the familiar 3, its constantly shifting architecture freezing into a single, fixed configuration. For the first time since his birth during the war in heaven, Tzeentch found himself constrained by the linear flow of causality, trapped in a single moment without the ability to transform into something else. Impossible, the changer of ways whispered, his voice no longer echoing from multiple timelines, but emerging from a single, fixed form. I am change itself. I am the force that drives evolution, that topples stagnant empires, that prevents the universe from crystallizing into lifeless perfection. You cannot destroy me without destroying the very concept of transformation itself. I do not seek to destroy change, the Emperor replied, beginning his advance across the now stable floor of the fortress. I seek to guide it. You have forgotten that transformation without purpose is merely chaos, that change without direction leads only to meaningless complexity. I will show the galaxy what change can become when it serves wisdom rather than whim. The battle that followed transcended the physical entirely and became a conflict between fundamental concepts made manifest. Tzeentch wielded the power of infinite possibility, summoning alternate versions of himself from timelines where he had been victorious, where he had learned different lessons, where he had evolved along different paths. The Emperor found himself facing not one enemy, but countless variations of the same foe, each one representing a different aspect of change run wild. Yet for every alternate Tzeentch that appeared, the Emperor called forth a corresponding version of himself, iterations from timelines where he had faced different challenges, learned different truths, developed different aspects of his infinite nature. The battle became a war between parallel selves, each side drawing upon the full scope of what they might have been across the infinite expanse of possibility. The fortress shook as the competing timelines collided and cancelled each other out. Reality itself began to fray at the edges, as past, present, and future became weapons in a conflict that threatened to unravel the fundamental structure of existence. Temporal paradoxes blossomed like flowers of pure impossibility, their resolution sending shock waves through dimensions that had remained stable since the birth of the universe. It was then that Tzeentch played his final gambit. Unable to defeat the Emperor in direct confrontation, the Changer of Ways reached back through time itself, seeking to prevent his own birth during the war in heaven 60 million years past. If he had never existed, then the changes he had wrought across the eons would unravel, creating a cascade of paradox that would tear reality apart and leave only chaos in its wake. The temporal assault struck at the very moment of Tzeentch's birth, that instant during the war in heaven when the first sentient being had wondered, what if, and given form to the concept of change itself. The chaos god's existence began to unravel from that primordial moment forward, his influence across the eons slowly dissolving as causality reasserted itself according to his altered timeline. Yet the Emperor was ready for this final, desperate stratagem. His own existence stretched back not millions, but tens of thousands of years, rooted in the collective sacrifice of the shamans, but extending through every moment of human history that he had touched. Where Tzeentch sought to unravel his own past, the Emperor reinforced it, pouring his will backward through time to ensure that the flow of causality remained intact. The two titans of possibility faced each other across the full expanse of temporal existence, their conflict playing out simultaneously in the primordial past and the infinite future. Yet where Tzeentch's nature as pure change made him vulnerable to paradox, the Emperor's role as humanity's eternal guardian gave him an anchor point that could not be altered. He had been present at every crucial moment in human history, not because he had changed the past, but because he had always been there, woven into the very fabric of his species' destiny. The paradox resolved itself with a sound like reality sighing in relief. Tzeentch's desperate gambit collapsed as the impossible logic of his self-erasure proved unable to overcome the simple fact of the Emperor's unshakable certainty. The Changer of Ways found himself restored to the present moment, but diminished, no longer the master of infinite possibility, but merely another player in a game whose rules he could no longer change at will. "It is finished," the Emperor declared, as the Apollonian spear found its mark in Tzeentch's crystalline heart. The weapon pierced not flesh but concept, striking at the very idea of change without purpose, transformation without wisdom, possibility without responsibility. Tzeentch's death was neither violent nor peaceful. It was simply a resolution. The infinite complexity of his nature collapsed into a single, final configuration as the Changer of Ways discovered what it meant to experience true, irreversible transformation. His dissolution sent waves of stabilizing force through the warp, crystallizing chaos into order, reducing infinite possibility to manageable probability. The effects rippled outward through the galaxy with the sudden finality of a thunderclap. On worlds where psychic storms had raged for millennia, the warp suddenly became calm and predictable. Psychers who had spent their lives fighting against the chaotic whispers in their minds found themselves able to focus their abilities with unprecedented precision. The wild mutations that had plagued humanity since the development of psychic potential began to stabilize, genetic aberrations either correcting themselves or settling into stable, non-threatening forms. On Terra, in the deep laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace, the most dramatic changes manifested in the gestation pods of the developing Primarchs. The final aspect of their genetic programming that had been touched by chaos, their potential for both transcendent greatness and catastrophic failure, suddenly stabilized. Where once each Primarch had carried the seeds of their own potential, downfall woven into their very DNA, now they bore only the capacity for growth, wisdom, and leadership. The terrible choices that might have led some of them to rebellion and damnation simply ceased to exist as possibilities. The Thunder Warriors experienced the change as a sudden clarity of purpose that cut through the genetic instability that had defined their existence. Many found their augmented metabolisms finally achieving a stable equilibrium, their enhanced aggression cooling to manageable levels of focused determination. Others discovered psychic potential that had been suppressed by the chaotic nature of their augmentation, gaining abilities that complemented rather than conflicted with their physical enhancements. In the crystal labyrinth that had been Tzeentch's domain, the impossible geometries began to reshape themselves into forms that served function rather than confusion. The maze that had trapped countless souls in eternal wandering became a great library where the genuine wisdom of the ages could be preserved and studied. The crystalline walls that had once reflected infinite possibility now showed clear paths forward, maps of potential that could guide rather than confuse those who sought knowledge. The Emperor stood alone in what had once been the impossible fortress, now transformed into something far more practical, a repository of genuine learning free from the corrupting influence of change for its own sake. In his hand, the Apollonian spear pulsed with new understanding, its power no longer merely destructive, but constructive, capable of imposing order on chaos while preserving the essential dynamism that drove growth and evolution. 3 of the 4 great chaos gods were dead, their influence purged from the galaxy through a combination of righteous force and philosophical clarity. Yet one remained, Slaanesh, the youngest of the dark powers, whose birth had been so recent that the echoes of the Eldari Empire's fall still resonated through the warp. The Prince of Pleasure represented a different kind of corruption than his brothers, not the mindless fury of Khorne, the patient decay of Nurgle, or the chaotic transformation of Tzeentch, but the perversion of beauty, art, and sensation into instruments of spiritual destruction. The Emperor began his advance toward the final battlefield, carrying with him the accumulated wisdom of 3 victories and the weight of understanding what it truly meant to reshape the fundamental forces of existence. The war against chaos was not yet finished, but for the first time in 60 million years, its outcome was no longer in doubt. Behind him, the transformed labyrinth continued its work of cataloguing genuine knowledge, its crystal walls reflecting not endless possibility, but clear, achievable paths toward wisdom and understanding. It was a monument to what change could become when guided by purpose rather than driven by whim, a fitting epitaph for the god who had forgotten that transformation must serve something greater than itself. Chapter 6. The Newborn's Slumber. The path to Slaanesh's domain was marked not by the familiar landmarks of ancient corruption, but by the raw, unformed nature of recent birth. Where the other chaos gods had ruled their realms for 60 million years, shaping them through eons of accumulated power, the Prince of Pleasure's territory bore all the characteristics of something newly awakened, beautiful but unstable, seductive but uncertain, magnificent in its excess, yet fragile in its fundamental structure. The emperor's approach was noted immediately by entities that had not yet learned the patient malice of their elder cousins. Demonettes danced through gardens of living sensation, their forms shifting between expressions of desire so pure they transcended the merely physical. They did not attack as the bloodletters of Khorne had done, nor whisper of decay as Nurgle's children might have. Instead, they offered glimpses of perfection, art so beautiful it could drive mortals to madness, music that captured the very essence of joy, experiences that promised to fulfill every dream the Emperor had ever harbored. Yet as the Emperor passed through these temptations, something unprecedented occurred. The offerings themselves began to change, becoming less perfect, less overwhelming, as if the mere presence of one who had transcended desire was teaching the realm's inhabitants what true fulfillment might look like. Where once they had offered sensation without meaning, now they found themselves attempting to create experiences that served some greater purpose. Art that inspired rather than enslaved, beauty that elevated rather than corrupted. The approach to Slanesh's palace revealed the newest Chaos God's essential nature more clearly than any description could have done. The structure was magnificent beyond mortal comprehension, spires that sang in harmonious resonance, walls that shifted through every color that had ever been imagined, and some that had not, gardens where every flower was a masterpiece of form and fragrance. Yet beneath the overwhelming beauty lay an instability that spoke of power not yet fully understood or controlled. Slanesh waited in the palace's heart, not on a throne, but in a chamber where reality itself had been shaped into an expression of pure aesthetic perfection. The youngest of the Chaos Gods appeared as a figure of such transcendent beauty that describing it would have been an exercise in futility. Every observer saw something different, each vision tailored to their deepest understanding of what perfection might look like. Yet unlike his ancient brothers, Slanesh's form flickered with uncertainty, the edges of his being blurring as if he had not yet decided exactly what he was meant to become. "Welcome, Golden One," Slanesh spoke, his voice a symphony of every beautiful sound that had ever existed. "I have felt your presence across the warp as you ended my brother's reigns. Such purpose, such single-minded determination. How beautifully pure in its own way. Tell me, have you come to destroy me as well? Or have you perhaps considered what the galaxy might become without any appreciation for beauty, for art, for the experiences that make existence worth living?" The Emperor paused at the chamber's threshold, studying not just Slanesh, but the realm that surrounded him. Where the other Chaos Gods had been ancient beyond measure, their corruption accumulated across geological ages, here was something different. Power that was vast but newly awakened, dangerous but not yet set in its patterns of destruction. The Prince of Pleasure was still learning what it meant to exist, still discovering the boundaries and possibilities of his nature. "You are different from your brothers," the Emperor observed, his voice carrying neither the righteous fury that had marked his confrontation with Khorne, nor the philosophical certainty that had characterized his debates with Nurgle and Tzeentch. They were corruption that had forgotten its original purpose. You are power that has not yet learned what purpose it might serve. Slanesh smiled, and the expression was both heartbreakingly beautiful and subtly wrong. Too perfect, too calculated, too aware of its own effect. Around them, the chamber shifted to accommodate different perspectives, showing glimpses of what aesthetic perfection might look like from every possible viewpoint. How astute. Yes, I am the youngest of what you call the Dark Gods, born from the passion and artistry of the Eldari in their final decadent centuries. I am sensation and experience, the drive to create and to feel and to push beyond the boundaries of what others deem acceptable. Without me, would your species ever produce great art? Would they ever experience the ecstasy of true love, the intoxication of perfect beauty, the transcendent joy of creation itself? The question struck deeper than the Emperor had expected. Unlike the clear corruption represented by his brothers, Slaanesh embodied aspects of existence that were not merely tolerable but necessary, the aesthetic drive that produced great art, the passion that fueled love and creation, the desire for perfection that pushed civilizations to achieve greatness. Yet he also represented the corruption of these drives into mere sensation-seeking, the pursuit of experience for its own sake, without regard for consequence or meaning. "Show me," the Emperor commanded. "Show me what you believe the galaxy should become." The chamber around them transformed into a vision of unparalleled beauty. Worlds where every building was a masterpiece of architectural harmony, where every citizen was an artist, capable of creating works that would have been considered impossible by earlier ages. Humanity spreading across the stars not as conquerors but as creators, leaving behind them a trail of magnificent civilizations that celebrated the full spectrum of sensation and experience. Yet as the vision unfolded, the Emperor began to see the flaws hidden within the beauty, the artists who had abandoned all other pursuits in their quest for perfect creation, leaving practical matters to decay around them. The lovers who had become so obsessed with the intensity of emotion that they forgot the bonds of responsibility and care that made love meaningful. The architects of beauty who had designed their masterpieces without regard for the needs of those who would live within them. Beautiful, the Emperor acknowledged, yet incomplete. You show me art without purpose, love without commitment, beauty without function. You have learned to inspire the drive toward perfection, but not the wisdom to guide it toward meaningful ends. Slaanesh's form solidified slightly, taking on aspects that were more challenging, more directly confrontational. And what would you put in my place, destroyer of gods? Your sterile vision of guided evolution? Your carefully controlled progress toward predetermined goals? How is that different from the stagnation you claim to oppose? The Emperor's response came not in words, but in action, yet not the destructive action that had characterized his confrontations with the other Chaos gods. Instead, he began to weave something new in the space between them, a construction of pure will that took the form of chains made not from metal, but from crystallized purpose. These were not bonds meant to cause suffering, but constraints designed to channel power toward meaningful expression. I do not seek to destroy you, the Emperor declared as the golden chains took shape around them. You are too newly born, too malleable, too potentially valuable to simply eliminate. Instead, I will bind you, not to cause pain, but to give you a time to learn what you might become when your power serves something greater than immediate gratification. The binding process was unlike anything the Emperor had attempted before, where the destruction of the other Chaos gods had required the application of overwhelming force. The containment of Slaanesh demanded delicacy and precision. He was not seeking to end the Prince of Pleasure's existence, but to lock him in a state of stasis where his power could not corrupt the galaxy, while he slowly learned what it meant to create beauty that served life rather than merely sensation. Slaanesh struggled against the bonds, but his resistance was more confused than truly hostile. The youngest Chaos god did not fully understand what was happening to him, his newly awakened consciousness unable to comprehend the concept of voluntary limitation in service of greater purpose. "This is not destruction," Slaanesh whispered, as the golden chain settled around him like a cocoon of pure light. "This is something else. What are you doing to me?" "Teaching you patience," the Emperor replied. "Your brothers lived for 60 million years and learned nothing but how to be more efficiently destructive. You have existed for mere centuries and might yet become something else entirely. But only if you have time to understand what beauty and sensation can become when they serve wisdom rather than impulse." The binding chamber that formed around the captive god was unlike the destroyed realms that marked the sites of his brother's defeat. Here, Slaanesh remained visible within walls of crystallized golden light, neither dead nor fully active, but suspended in a state where he could observe and learn without directly influencing events. It was a prison, but one designed more like a chrysalis, a place where transformation might occur if the prisoner proved capable of growth. The effects of Slaanesh's binding rippled across the galaxy with subtlety that contrasted sharply with the dramatic changes that had followed his brother's deaths. On worlds where artistic traditions had been touched by the Prince of Pleasure's influence, the most excessive and destructive expressions of creativity began to moderate. Painters who had been driven to use their own blood as pigment found themselves experimenting with conventional materials that produced equally powerful effects. Musicians who had sought ever more extreme sensations in their performances discovered new depths in classical forms. Yet the changes brought unexpected complications. On some worlds, the sudden absence of Slaanesh's direct influence led to a temporary dampening of artistic inspiration itself. Poets found their verses lacking the fire that had once driven them to greatness. Sculptors discovered that their works, while technically proficient, no longer moved viewers to tears of transcendent joy. The galaxy had gained protection from the excesses of uncontrolled aesthetic pursuit, but at the cost of some of the very inspiration that made art possible. On Terra, in the laboratories deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the effects manifested in the final stabilization of the Primarch's genetic templates. The last aspect of their design that had been touched by chaos, their potential for both transcendent achievement and self-destructive excess, found itself balanced rather than eliminated. Where they might once have been driven to extremes of perfectionism that could have led to madness, they now possessed the drive for excellence, tempered by wisdom and restraint. The Thunder Warriors felt the change as a subtle shift in their enhanced metabolisms. Many discovered that the stimulants and hormone treatments that had sustained their augmented forms were no longer necessary. Their bodies had found a natural equilibrium that no longer required artificial enhancement to maintain. Others found their enhanced senses becoming more discriminating, able to appreciate beauty and perfection without being overwhelmed by the intensity of sensation. The Emperor stood before the completed binding chamber, watching as Slaanesh slowly adapted to his new constraints. Unlike the empty spaces that marked the sites where the other Chaos gods had been destroyed, this place hummed with potential, not the chaotic possibility that had characterized Tzeentch's domain, but the focused potential of power learning to serve something greater than itself. "Sleep and learn, Prince of Pleasure," the Emperor spoke to the figure within the golden cocoon. "When you wake, if you wake, perhaps you will understand what it means to create beauty that serves life rather than enslaving it." The binding was not a permanent solution, the Emperor knew. Slaanesh's prison was strong, but the youngest Chaos god was still growing, still learning, still becoming something that might eventually transcend the constraints that held him. Yet it bought time for the galaxy to develop its own relationship with art and beauty, Time for humanity to learn what aesthetic achievement could become when it was not corrupted by the pursuit of sensation for its own sake. 3 chaos gods lay dead, their influence purged from reality itself. The 4th was bound, contained but not destroyed, his power redirected toward the possibility of future redemption rather than present corruption. For the first time in 60 million years, the galaxy existed free from the direct influence of the dark gods. Yet the Emperor understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The real test would come in what humanity and the other races of the galaxy made of their newfound freedom. Would they prove capable of growing into the potential that the removal of chaos had opened for them? Or would they find new ways to corrupt themselves, new paths toward the very darkness that the Emperor had fought so hard to eliminate? Only time would provide those answers. For now, it was enough that the war against the Chaos Gods was won, and the galaxy stood poised to discover what it might become when freed from the influence of entities that had shaped it for longer than most stars had burned. The Emperor began his journey back toward the material realm, carrying with him the weight of victory and the uncertainty of what that victory would ultimately mean. Behind him, 4 realms of the warp stood transformed, 3 empty and cleansed, 1 occupied by a prisoner who might someday become something greater than the sum of his original nature. The age of chaos was ending. What would follow remained to be written. Chapter 7. The Silent Imperium. The Emperor's return to his physical form was marked not by the violent re-entry that he had expected, but by a gentle settling of consciousness into flesh that felt somehow different than when he had left it. The golden shell that housed his immortal essence had remained in perfect stasis within the Sanctum Imperialis throughout his war in the warp, sustained by the careful ministrations of the custodian guard and the psychic wards that Malcador had woven around the chamber. Yet as his spirit descended from the immaterial realm back into the material universe, he could sense that something fundamental had changed, not just in himself, but in the very fabric of reality around him. The first sensation to greet his renewed awareness was silence. Not the absence of sound, for the palace hummed with its usual activity, but the absence of whispers that had plagued human consciousness since the birth of the first Psyker. The constant background murmur of chaos that had colored every psychic perception for 60 million years had simply stopped. The warp, while still present and still necessary for faster-than-light travel and communication, had become something altogether different, a realm of pure possibility rather than malevolent intention. Malcador was at his side before the Emperor had fully opened his eyes, the ancient Psyker's weathered features showing a mixture of relief and profound exhaustion. The Sigillite had maintained the protective wards around the Sanctum Imperialis for weeks, drawing upon reserves of power that would have killed a lesser being. Dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless vigils, while the slight tremor in his hands revealed the cost of channeling energies that had grown increasingly stable and predictable as the Emperor's work in the warp progressed. "My lord," Malcador spoke, his voice hoarse from extended periods of chanting the protective mantras. "You have been gone for 47 days. The galaxy has changed in ways we never imagined possible." The Emperor rose from the circle of power, his movements fluid despite the long period of physical inactivity. Around him, the custodian guard maintained their vigilant watch, though their posture had subtly shifted during his absence. Where once they had stood ready to repel the chaotic influences that might have sought to corrupt their master's undefended form, now they seemed more like honor guards than desperate defenders, their eternal vigilance unchanged, but the nature of what they guarded against fundamentally altered. "Show me," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the transformed nature of the warp itself. The years of battle in the immaterial realm had left their mark upon him, not as corruption or weakness, but as a deeper understanding of what reality could become when freed from the influence of malevolent gods. The reports came in a steady stream as the Emperor made his way through the palace corridors toward the great communications center, where the Imperium maintained contact with its scattered outposts across the galaxy. Custodian Captain Valdor met them at the first intersection, his usually impassive features showing an emotion that the Emperor had rarely seen there. Something approaching wonder, my lord. The psychers of the Scholastica Psychana report that warp travel has become safer by orders of magnitude. Ships that would have required weeks of careful navigation through chaotic currents are now completing their journeys in a fraction of the time. Navigator houses across human space are sending reports of previously impossible routes opening up, while the most dangerous warp storms have simply dissipated. They passed through chambers where tech adepts worked frantically to catalog the changes in their equipment. Devices that had relied on the chaotic nature of the warp for their function were finding new stable configurations, while experimental technologies that had been deemed too dangerous due to chaos interference were suddenly showing unprecedented promise. The very air seemed cleaner, free from the psychic miasma that had tainted human space since the species first developed psychic potential. In the deep laboratories where the Primarchs continued their development, the changes were most apparent. The 20 gestation pods hummed with increased activity as their occupants' growth accelerated beyond all projected parameters. Where the Chaos God's influence had once introduced elements of uncertainty and potential corruption into their genetic templates, now pure purpose drove their development. Each Primarch was becoming exactly what the Emperor had intended them to be, not weapons barely controlled by their creators, but generals and leaders capable of guiding humanity toward its destined greatness. Tekmagos Arkan Land looked up from his monitoring stations as the Emperor approached, his mechanical augmentations clicking with barely contained excitement. My lord, the rate of stable genetic expression has increased by 300% since the warp disturbances ceased. Primarchs 4 and 6 are showing signs of consciousness development ahead of all projections. If current trends continue, they will be ready for decanting within months rather than years. The Emperor studied the readouts with growing understanding. His sons were no longer developing under the shadow of potential corruption, their growth patterns freed to follow the pure expression of their intended nature. Yet with that freedom came new responsibilities. They would need guidance and education that took into account their unprecedented rate of development, training that prepared them for a galaxy that would be fundamentally different from the one he had originally envisioned. The communications center buzzed with activity as reports arrived from across human space. Astropathic choirs that had struggled for millennia to maintain contact across the vast distances of the galaxy were now achieving clarity of communication that would have been impossible under the old conditions. Messages that had once taken months to transmit were crossing the void in days, while the psychic static that had made long-range coordination a matter of educated guesswork had cleared to reveal the true scope of human civilization. Astropath Prime, Ileana Nazari approached with a data slate whose contents seemed to have surprised even her experienced mind. My lord, we have received reports from 17 frontier worlds that had been considered lost to warp storms. The clearing of the psychic tempests has revealed not just their survival, but their prosperity. Colonies that we believed were struggling with basic subsistence have achieved technological advancement that rivals Terra itself. The Emperor accepted the data slate and studied its contents with growing amazement. World after world reported similar phenomena. Societies that had been isolated by warp storms for centuries emerging to reveal advancement that defied their apparent limitations. Without the corrupting influence of chaos to disrupt their development, human ingenuity had flourished in ways that even he had not anticipated. Technologies that combined archaeotech principles with innovative applications, social structures that balanced individual achievement with collective good, cultural developments that produced art and literature of unprecedented beauty and depth. Yet not all the reports brought unqualified good news. On several worlds, the sudden absence of chaos influence had created unexpected problems. Societies that had defined themselves in opposition to corruption found themselves without a unifying purpose. Warrior cultures that had spent millennia fighting demonic incursions were struggling to adapt to a universe where such threats no longer existed. Some worlds reported increasing isolation and stagnation as their populations, freed from external threats, began to turn inward rather than striving for continued advancement. The implications struck the Emperor with the force of revelation. His victory over the Chaos Gods had indeed freed humanity from the greatest threat to its survival and development, but it had also removed the external pressure that had driven much of human advancement. The galaxy would need new challenges, new purposes, new frontiers to explore if it was to avoid the stagnation that had claimed so many previous civilizations. Malcador joined him at the great viewing screen that displayed the current state of human space. The familiar map of scattered colonies and fortress worlds remained unchanged, but the data streams flowing between them told a different story entirely. Trade routes that had been too dangerous to maintain were reopening, while colonies that had existed in isolation for generations were beginning to re-establish contact with the broader human community. The Great Crusade will need to be fundamentally reconsidered, the Emperor mused, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility. I had planned to unify humanity through conquest, to reclaim our lost colonies by force and bring them into compliance with imperial doctrine. But if these reports are accurate, many of these worlds no longer need to be conquered. They need to be invited to join something greater than themselves. The Sigillite nodded slowly, his ancient features reflecting deep thought. The Thunder Warriors report that their gene seed modifications are stabilizing beyond all expectations. Many are requesting reassignment from combat roles to exploration and construction duties. They speak of a desire to build rather than destroy, to create rather than conquer. It was a profound shift that reflected the broader changes rippling through the galaxy. The genetic templates that had created the Thunder Warriors had been designed for warfare against chaotic enemies, their enhanced aggression and resilience serving them well in the brutal conflicts that had characterized the Unification Wars. But with chaos no longer feeding that aggression with psychic influence, many were discovering aspects of their nature that had been suppressed: architectural vision, technological innovation, diplomatic insight. The Emperor moved to the strategic planning chamber, where his generals had been developing the preliminary phases of the Great Crusade. The maps and battle plans that covered the walls seemed suddenly antiquated, their assumptions based on a galaxy where human colonies existed under constant threat from chaos corruption. He would need new strategies, new approaches that emphasized cooperation over conquest, integration over domination. "Summon the Mechanicus delegation," he commanded. "If we are to explore rather than conquer, we will need ships designed for long-term exploration rather than short-term warfare. The Great Crusade will become something unprecedented, a mission of unification through diplomacy backed by strength, rather than conquest justified by necessity." As the palace prepared for this fundamental shift in imperial strategy, reports continued to arrive that painted an increasingly complex picture of the transformed galaxy. Some regions showed unprecedented cooperation between previously hostile human factions, as the psychic pressures that had fueled ancient grudges simply evaporated. Others revealed the emergence of new forms of government and social organization that took advantage of the improved communication and reduced external threats to create more efficient and equitable societies. Yet underlying all these positive developments was a subtle sense of uncertainty that the Emperor found deeply troubling. Humanity had defined itself for millennia in opposition to the forces of chaos, building its institutions and culture around the need to resist corruption and survive in a hostile universe. With that existential threat removed, the species would need to discover new sources of meaning and purpose, or risk falling into the very stagnation that he had fought so hard to prevent. The Thunder Warriors who had served as honor guards during his warp excursion requested audience, their leader Arik Taranis approaching with an expression that mixed respect with genuine curiosity. "My lord, we have felt the changes in our very bones. The rage that drove us to excel in battle has cooled to determination. The fury that sustained us has become focused purpose. We request permission to serve in new capacities, as explorers, as builders, as the vanguard of peaceful expansion rather than violent conquest." The Emperor granted the request, understanding that the transformation of his first enhanced soldiers reflected the broader changes that would be necessary across all aspects of imperial society. The galaxy no longer needed warriors trained for eternal war against chaos corruption. It needed leaders capable of building something greater than mere survival. As night fell over Terra, the Emperor stood alone in his private chambers, gazing out at stars that seemed somehow brighter than they had before his departure for the warp. The immediate victory was complete. 3 chaos gods destroyed, 1 bound, the galaxy freed from their corrupting influence. Yet the true test was only beginning. Would humanity prove worthy of the freedom he had won for them? Would they use their liberation from the external threats to achieve the greatness that had always been their potential? Or would they succumb to new forms of corruption and stagnation? The silence of the warp, so welcome after millennia of chaotic whispers, also represented a loss. The external pressure that had driven human innovation and advancement was gone, replaced by the need for internal motivation and self-directed purpose. It was a challenge that would test not just his leadership, but the fundamental character of the species he had sworn to protect. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new strategies, new approaches to the transformed galaxy. The Great Crusade would proceed, but it would be unlike anything that had been planned before. It would be an exploration of what humanity could become when freed from the fear of corruption, a test of whether the species could find meaning in creation rather than merely in survival. The Emperor returned to his planning, knowing that the war against chaos had ended. But the greater challenge of guiding humanity toward its destiny was only just beginning. Chapter 8. The Thunder Warriors' Last Stand. The first signs of crisis emerged not in the grand communications chambers or the strategic planning rooms, but in the medical wings deep beneath the Imperial Palace, where the Thunder Warriors underwent their regular genetic monitoring. Tech Adept Moravec had been tracking the anomalous readings for several days before he finally requested an audience with the Emperor, his augmetic sensors detecting patterns in the data that defied his most pessimistic projections. "My lord," Moravec spoke, his mechanical voice carrying an unusual tremor of uncertainty. "The genetic degradation curves for the Legiocategus have accelerated beyond all previous parameters. Where once the Thunder Warriors' enhanced physiology was gradually deteriorating over years or decades, we are now seeing critical system failures developing within months. The Emperor studied the data streams flowing across the hololithic displays with growing understanding. The irony was as bitter as it was unexpected. His victory over the Chaos Gods had indeed stabilized many aspects of human genetic modification, but it had also removed the chaotic energies that had been masking the fundamental flaws in the Thunder Warriors' augmented biology. Where once the random mutations induced by warp exposure had provided temporary patches for their degenerating systems, now those same systems faced their inherent limitations without external interference. The Thunder Warriors had been his first attempt at creating enhanced soldiers capable of unifying Terra under imperial rule. Their gene seed modifications were crude by later standards, achieved through techniques that prioritized immediate battlefield effectiveness over long-term biological stability. They had been designed as a temporary solution, enhanced warriors who could conquer Terra and then gracefully transition to other roles as more sophisticated augmentation techniques were developed. Yet chaos corruption had complicated that timeline. The slow genetic degradation that should have become apparent within decades of their creation had been masked by the mutagenic influence of the warp, their failing systems compensated for by random changes that occasionally improved function, even as they introduced new instabilities. The removal of chaos influence had stripped away these compensating factors, leaving the Thunder Warriors face to face with the true scope of their biological limitations. Arcturanis found the Emperor in the Hall of Victories, studying the campaign records that chronicled the Unification Wars. The leader of the Thunder Warriors moved with the same predatory grace that had characterized his kind since their creation. Yet there was something different in his bearing, a subtle uncertainty that spoke of growing awareness that his brotherhood faced an uncertain future. "My lord," Tyrannus spoke, his enhanced vocal cords giving his words the resonant quality that had once struck fear into the hearts of techno-barbarian warlords. "We must speak. The warriors grow restless. They sense that something fundamental has changed, not just in the galaxy, but in themselves. Many are experiencing symptoms they do not understand, metabolic fluctuations, neural instabilities, system cascades that our field medics cannot explain." The Emperor turned from his contemplation of past victories to face the architect of so many of them. Arcturanis was everything the Thunder Warriors were meant to be: brilliant, powerful, absolutely loyal, and utterly dedicated to the imperial cause. He was also dying by degrees, his enhanced physiology slowly consuming itself as the genetic modifications that had made him superhuman gradually turned against his biological systems. "Walk with me, Arik," the Emperor commanded, leading his first general toward the observation galleries that looked out over the palace's training grounds. Below them, Thunder Warriors drilled in formations that had conquered continents, their movements still precise despite the growing instabilities in their augmented systems. "Tell me what you have observed among your brothers." Tyrannus matched the Emperor's pace, though careful observation revealed the slight compensations he was making for balance issues that had not existed even weeks earlier. "Sergeant Gotha collapsed during routine exercises yesterday. The medico found critical failures in his secondary heart and redundant organ systems. Corporal Ushotan has been experiencing memory fragmentation. He can recall every detail of the Battle of Morland Sen, but cannot remember conversations from the previous day. Squad leader Babu reports that his enhanced reflexes are becoming erratic, sometimes functioning at peak efficiency, other times failing entirely." The catalogue of symptoms painted a clear picture of systemic breakdown across multiple biological systems. The Thunder Warriors were not merely aging, they were experiencing cascading failure of the very modifications that had made them superhuman. Without the chaotic mutations that had previously provided temporary workarounds for these failures, the fundamental flaws in their genetic architecture were becoming impossible to ignore. They paused at a great window that offered a panoramic view of Terra's restored surface. Where once had sprawled the techno-barbarian wastelands that the Thunder Warriors had conquered through decades of brutal warfare, now stretched the ordered districts of the unified world that their sacrifices had made possible. The irony was not lost on either figure. The warriors who had made this transformation possible were now being left behind by that very success. "You know," Tyrannus said quietly, his enhanced vision tracking the movement of aircraft between the palace spires, "that we were never meant to be permanent. When you first gathered us from the remnants of the gene cults and barbarian kingdoms, you spoke of service that would span decades, not centuries. We understood that we were the first step toward something greater, not the final goal itself." The Emperor's silence stretched long enough that a lesser being might have begun to doubt whether he had spoken at all. When he finally responded, his voice carried the weight of decisions that would reshape the future of human civilization. "I had hoped to give you more time. The new enhancement protocols show promise, gene seed modifications that provide the same battlefield effectiveness without the inherent instabilities that plague your current augmentation. Given another decade, perhaps 2, we might have found ways to correct the flaws in your genetic template, to grant you the extended lifespans that your service has earned." Tyrannus turned from the window to face his creator and commander, understanding dawning in his enhanced consciousness. "But the victory over the Chaos Gods has accelerated everything. Without the warp mutations that were compensating for our genetic flaws, we no longer have decades. We have months, perhaps weeks, before the cascading failures become irreversible." "Some of you may have longer," the Emperor acknowledged. "The degradation affects each Thunder Warrior differently, based on the specific modifications they received and their individual biology. But you are correct that the timeline has changed dramatically. The question now becomes what we do with the time that remains." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices echoing through the palace corridors. Captain General Valdor appeared at the gallery entrance, his usually impassive features showing the strain of urgent concern. "My lord, we have a developing situation in Training Complex 7. A group of Thunder Warriors led by Sergeant Gota have barricaded themselves in the armory. They are demanding answers about the medical reports, about the new gene seed projects, about what they believe to be preparations for their replacement." The Emperor's response was immediate and decisive. "Assemble the custodian guard, full battle readiness, but no aggressive action without my direct command. Arik, will you come with me? Your brothers may listen to you where they would not heed others." The march to Training Complex 7 revealed the depth of the crisis that was developing within the Thunder Warriors' ranks. Along the corridors, other enhanced soldiers watched with expressions that mixed loyalty with growing uncertainty. They had served the Emperor with absolute dedication through the worst conflicts of the Unification Wars, yet now they faced the possibility that their service was coming to an end, not through glorious death in battle, but through slow biological failure. The barricaded armory represented more than simple rebellion. It was a manifestation of the Thunder Warriors' growing awareness that they were being phased out in favor of newer, more stable enhancement techniques. Through the sealed blast doors, they could hear voices raised in heated discussion, the enhanced hearing of their augmented physiologies picking up fragments of conversation that spoke of betrayal, abandonment, and the growing certainty that they were no longer valued by the regime they had helped create. "Gota!" Arik Tyrannus called through the reinforced entrance, his voice carrying the authority of decades of shared combat experience. "Open the doors. The Emperor himself has come to speak with you." The response came after a long pause, Sergeant Gota's voice distorted by the vox grills built into his enhanced larynx. "Why should we trust anything he says? The Medici reports speak of genetic failure, of cascading system breakdown. The tech adepts whisper of new soldiers, enhanced warriors who will replace us. Are we to be discarded like broken equipment after all we have sacrificed?" The Emperor stepped forward, his presence somehow reaching through the sealed barriers to touch the consciousness of those within. When he spoke, his voice carried not the authority of command, but the sadness of one who truly understood the cost of necessary decisions. "You have served with honor beyond measure. Every victory achieved during the Unification Wars was won through your sacrifice, your dedication, your willingness to bear modifications that you knew might cost you your lives. I will not insult that service with comfortable lies about what the future holds." The blast doors opened slowly, revealing 15 Thunder Warriors in full combat gear. Their enhanced physiologies were clearly showing signs of the genetic instabilities that plagued their kind. Subtle tremors, asymmetrical muscle development, the telltale signs of organ systems operating beyond their design parameters. Yet their weapons remained lowered, their posture speaking more of desperate need for understanding than genuine hostility. Sergeant Gota stepped forward, his scarred features showing the accumulated damage of 100 battles. "Then tell us the truth, my lord. Are we dying? Are we being replaced? Have our years of service earned us anything more than a slow death in medical wards?" The Emperor's response came not in words but in action. He moved among the assembled Thunder Warriors with movements that spoke of perfect understanding and absolute compassion. His hands, when he placed them upon their shoulders, carried a warmth that penetrated their enhanced nervous systems and spoke directly to their augmented consciousness. "You are dying," he acknowledged, the simple honesty of the statement carrying more weight than any elaborate explanation. "The genetic modifications that made you superhuman are consuming your biology faster than your enhanced metabolism can compensate. Without the chaotic mutations that were previously masking these failures, you have months rather than years." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of acknowledgement and acceptance. These were warriors who had faced death in 1,000 forms, yet the certainty of biological failure carried a different kind of finality than the clean ending offered by battlefield mortality. "What would you have of us?" Tyrannus asked, speaking for his brothers as much as himself. "We are Thunder Warriors. We were made for war, trained for battle, augmented for conflict. If our time is ending, let it end as it was meant to end, with purpose, with meaning, with the knowledge that our deaths serve something greater than ourselves." The Emperor's proposal was both merciful and pragmatic. Rather than allowing the Thunder Warriors to face slow degradation and eventual death from system failure, he offered them a choice. Those who wished could serve in the preliminary phases of the developing Great Crusade, their expertise and experience helping to train the next generation of enhanced warriors before their own biology failed. Others could choose a warrior's ending, a final battle against overwhelming odds that would grant them the death in combat that their enhanced nature demanded. The response was immediate and unanimous. To a warrior, the Thunder Warriors chose service over surrender. They would use their remaining time to help perfect the techniques that would create their successors, passing on hard-won experience to ensure that the mistakes made in their own enhancement would not be repeated. And when their biology finally failed beyond all medical intervention, they would face that ending with the same courage that had carried them through the conquest of terror. The months that followed saw a transformation in the relationship between the Thunder Warriors and their would-be successors. In the deep laboratories where the proto-astartes underwent their enhancement procedures, veteran warriors served as instructors and advisors, their practical experience complementing the theoretical knowledge of the tech adepts. The mistakes and limitations that had characterized the Thunder Warriors' genetic modification were carefully catalogued and corrected, each failure becoming a lesson that would make their replacements stronger and more stable. Yet the cost was heartbreaking to observe. Each day brought new evidence of the Thunder Warriors' declining condition. Warriors who had once been capable of incredible feats of strength and endurance found themselves struggling with basic physical tasks. Enhanced senses began to fail, augmented reflexes became unreliable, redundant organs started to shut down one by one. Arik Taranis was among the last to succumb to the genetic cascade that claimed his brotherhood. On the day when his enhanced physiology finally failed beyond all medical intervention, he requested one final audience with his emperor. The meeting took place in the same Hall of Victories where they had first discussed the developing crisis, the records of conquest serving as a fitting backdrop for their final conversation. "It has been an honor," Taranis said, his voice now requiring mechanical assistance as his enhanced vocal cords began their final failure. "To serve, to fight, to help build something greater than any of us individually. The warriors who will replace us will be better than we were, stronger, more stable, longer lived. Yet I believe they will never quite match the desperate courage that came from knowing we were imperfect, that our time was limited, that each battle might be our last." The Emperor's farewell to his first enhanced warriors was conducted with the full honors due to heroes who had shaped the course of human history. Each Thunder Warrior who chose a warrior's ending was granted a death in battle befitting their enhanced nature. Those who succumbed to genetic failure were mourned with ceremonies that acknowledged both their sacrifices and their achievements. In the end, the Thunder Warriors' legacy lay not in their own survival, but in the lessons their sacrifice provided to those who would follow. The proto-astartes who emerged from the enhanced laboratories carried genetic modifications that had been refined through careful study of their predecessors' failures. They were stronger, more stable, more capable of long-term service than the Thunder Warriors had ever been. Yet they also carried something more subtle, an understanding that enhancement came with cost, that superhuman ability required superhuman responsibility, and that those who accepted genetic modification in service of humanity did so knowing that their lives would be forever changed by that choice. The last Thunder Warrior died on a day when Terra's skies were particularly clear, his enhanced eyes able to see the stars that beckoned with promise of the great crusade that would soon begin. His final words, recorded by the Medicae who attended his passing, spoke not of regret or bitterness, but of satisfaction that his sacrifice had contributed to something greater than himself. The Emperor stood alone in the empty barracks that had once housed his first enhanced warriors, surrounded by the echoes of victories that had shaped a world. The Thunder Warriors were gone, their genetic legacy preserved only in the hard-won lessons that would guide their successors. Yet their true inheritance was something that couldn't be measured in DNA sequences or enhancement protocols, the example they had set of service without reservation, sacrifice without complaint, and dedication to purposes greater than individual survival. The Great Crusade would begin soon, carried forward by enhanced warriors whose genetic stability owed much to the failures and sacrifices of those who had come before. It would be a fitting tribute to the Thunder Warriors' memory, a galaxy united not through the desperate expedients that had characterized the conquest of Terra, but through the refined techniques and hard-won wisdom that their sacrifice had made possible. Chapter 9. The Primarchs Awakened. The day of awakening began before Terra's dawn, heralded not by the gradual lightening of artificial suns, but by a resonance that thrummed through the deepest foundations of the imperial palace. In the sealed chambers where 20 gestation pods had maintained their vigil for years beyond counting, something unprecedented was occurring. The genetic templates that had developed within those crystalline wombs were reaching the culmination of their long maturation. Not as scattered demigods cast across the galaxy by chaotic forces, but as unified suns gathering in the presence of their creator. The Emperor felt their stirring consciousness like distant stars igniting in the void of space. Each Primarch's awakening sent ripples through the immaterial realm, their psychic signatures blazing with power unmarred by the corruption that had once threatened to poison their development. Where chaos influence might have introduced elements of madness, treachery, or spiritual hunger, now there was only pure purpose. 20 minds awakening to discover their intended destiny, free from the whispers of dark gods. Mulkador stood at the Emperor's side as they approached the great laboratory complex, his ancient features showing exhaustion that spoke of weeks spent maintaining the protective wards around the gestation chambers. The Sigillite had not slept properly since the day the last Chaos God had fallen, his psychic senses detecting the accelerating development of the Primarchs with growing anticipation and concern. The biometric readings stabilized 12 hours ago, he reported, his voice hoarse from the extended periods of chanting that had maintained the laboratory's spiritual defenses. Tecmagos Archenland confirms that all 20 specimens are within optimal parameters for awakening. Yet I confess, my lord, that I find myself uncertain of what we will find when those pods finally open. The Emperor's response carried the weight of a father's hope, tempered by a creator's understanding of what he had wrought. We will find what they were always meant to be, old friend. Not weapons shaped by necessity and hardened by corruption, but leaders capable of guiding humanity toward the destiny that has always been our birthright. The laboratory complex that housed the gestation pods was a marvel of archaeotech and genetic engineering that represented the pinnacle of human scientific achievement. 20 crystalline chambers arranged in a perfect circle around a central dais where monitoring equipment tracked every aspect of the developing Primarch's physiology. Each pod hummed with energies that maintained the delicate balance between growth and stability, their surfaces reflecting the golden radiance of the forms that stirred within. Tecmagos Archenland approached with data slates whose readings showed patterns that defied his most optimistic projections. My lord, the genetic stability indices are beyond anything we dared hope for. The cellular integrity ratings show no signs of degradation, while the psychic development curves indicate mental faculties that have achieved full maturation without any of the dangerous fluctuations that characterized earlier projections. The first pod to complete its awakening cycle was numbered with the numeral 1, its crystalline surface beginning to iris open with movements that resembled the unfolding of a flower. Within lay a figure of such perfect proportions that he seemed less a creation of genetic engineering than the idealized expression of human potential made manifest. As consciousness returned to features that would one day be known across the galaxy, the being that would be called Horus opened eyes that held the clarity of absolute purpose, unmarred by future corruption. The Primarch's first words upon awakening were not a cry of confusion or disorientation, but a statement of understanding that spoke to the depth of knowledge that had been encoded into his genetic matrix during the long years of development. Father, I know you, as I know my purpose. I am your son, created to serve humanity's expansion among the stars. I am ready." The Emperor approached the awakening Primarch with movements that spoke of paternal pride and creator's satisfaction. When he placed his hand upon Horus's shoulder, the connection between them blazed with psychic resonance that carried no taint of future betrayal or corrupted ambition. Here was loyalty in its purest form, not blind obedience, but conscious choice to serve something greater than oneself. "Welcome to consciousness, my son. You are the first of your brothers to wake, as you were always meant to be. Rise, and help me greet the others as they join us." The awakening of the remaining 19 Primarchs followed in rapid succession, each emergence revealing personalities that had developed free from the influences that might have corrupted their intended nature. Magnus emerged from his pod with eyes that blazed with psychic power, yet when he turned his gaze toward the immaterial realm, he found only the stable energies of a warp, cleansed of malevolent entities. His first words spoke of wonder, rather than the forbidden knowledge that had once led him astray. "The barriers between material and immaterial are so clear," Magnus marveled, his enhanced consciousness exploring the transformed nature of the warp with the joy of a scholar discovering a vast library. "I can sense the threads that connect all living things, yet there are no whispers of corruption, no voices offering forbidden power. This is what psychic ability was always meant to be, a tool for understanding, not a gateway to damnation." Angron's awakening revealed perhaps the most dramatic difference from what might have been. Where corruption might have filled him with endless rage and the psychic echoes of Khorne's influence, the Primarch that emerged from his pod possessed the controlled fury of a warrior philosopher. His strength was evident in every movement, yet it was strength tempered by wisdom rather than driven by bloodlust. "I feel the warrior's instincts burning within me," Angron acknowledged as he tested his enhanced reflexes, "yet they serve a greater purpose than mere violence. I understand now that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction serves life, and when it merely feeds emptiness." Lorgar's awakening brought forth a seeker of truth, whose spiritual hunger would find no satisfaction in the dark gods that no longer existed to corrupt his quest. His eyes, when they opened, held the fervor of one dedicated to discovering the sacred, yet his first words spoke of purposes that served humanity rather than enslaving it. "I sense the divine essence that flows through all creation," Lorgar declared, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of reality. Yet it is not the divinity of distant gods demanding worship, but the sacred potential that exists within humanity itself. We are called to nurture this divine spark, not to subjugate ourselves before false idols. One by one, the remaining Primarchs joined their awakened brothers. Guilliman, with his gift for organization and governance, Dawn with his mastery of defense and fortification, the Khan with his understanding of swift warfare and tactical mobility. Each awakening revealed personalities that had reached their full potential without the corruption that had once threatened to twist their nature toward darkness. Yet perhaps the most significant absence was what didn't occur. There were no seeds of future rivalry planted between the brothers, no whispers of ambition that might lead to civil war, no subtle corruptions that would eventually tear the nascent imperium apart from within. The Primarchs looked upon each other and saw not potential rivals, but true brothers united in common purpose. The Emperor gathered his 20 sons around the central dais, where monitoring equipment continued to track the miraculous stability of their awakening. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had guided humanity through its darkest hours, and now stood ready to lead them toward their greatest triumphs. My sons, you wake to a galaxy transformed. The ancient enemies that have plagued thinking beings since the war in heaven have been destroyed or bound beyond their ability to cause harm. The warp that once carried whispers of corruption now flows with clean purpose. Humanity stands poised to reclaim its birthright among the stars, not through conquest alone, but through the wisdom to unite the scattered children of Terra into something greater than any have achieved before. Horus, as the first awakened, spoke for his brothers when he responded to their father's words. What would you have of us, Father? We were created to lead, to command, to guide humanity's expansion across the galaxy. Yet if the threats that originally justified our creation have been eliminated, what form should that leadership take? The Emperor's response revealed the depth of thought that he had given to this moment during the long months since his return from the warp. You will still lead the Great Crusade, but it will be a crusade unlike any originally envisioned. Where we once planned conquest to reunify scattered human colonies by force, we will now offer unification through demonstrated superiority of purpose. Where we once expected to fight corrupted civilizations that had fallen to chaos influence, we will now encounter societies that have had the opportunity to develop according to their own nature. Magnus raised a question that spoke to the philosophical implications of their transformed mission. And what of the alien civilizations we encounter? Without chaos corruption driving them to hostility, might we not find opportunities for cooperation rather than extermination? We will judge each encounter according to its own merits, the Emperor replied. The xenocidal policies that might have been necessary in a galaxy where chaos corruption could spread between species are no longer automatically justified. We will seek cooperation where possible, containment where necessary, and elimination only when no other option serves humanity's long-term survival. The first council of the awakened Primarchs took place in the great strategic chamber that had been prepared for their use, its surfaces displaying star charts and strategic assessments that painted a picture of a galaxy ripe for peaceful expansion. The 20 demigods studied the reports with minds that had been designed for strategic thinking, yet their discussions focused not on conquest, but on construction, not on the breaking of enemy resistance, but on the building of lasting alliances. Guilliman's administrative genius immediately grasped the logistical implications of their transformed mission. We will need entirely different organizational structures for peaceful expansion than those designed for military conquest. Diplomatic corps, trade negotiators, cultural exchange specialists, the Legion structures must be adapted to serve these purposes alongside their military functions. Dawn's strategic mind focused on the defensive implications of their new approach. Peaceful expansion will require different forms of security than military conquest. We must be prepared to defend not just territory, but principles, not just resources, but relationships. The fortifications we build must protect cooperation as much as they secure conquest. The Khan's understanding of mobility and speed translated naturally to the requirements of exploration and first contact. Swift response capabilities become even more important when the goal is establishing positive relationships rather than achieving battlefield dominance. We must be able to reach new worlds quickly enough to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into conflicts. As the discussions continued, patterns emerged that would have been impossible under the shadow of chaos corruption. The Primarchs' natural talents, freed from the distortions that might have twisted them toward rivalry and betrayal, began to complement each other in ways that promised unprecedented effectiveness. Where canon might have seen the seeds of future civil war, this gathering revealed the potential for cooperation on a scale that could reshape the galaxy itself. The decision to restructure the planned Space Marine legions reflected this new reality. Rather than 20 legions designed primarily for warfare against corrupted enemies, the Primarchs would lead organizations that combined military capability with diplomatic, exploratory, and constructive functions. Each legion would serve as both sword and shield for humanity's expansion, but also as ambassadors and builders of the civilization that expansion would create. "We will be more than conquerors," Lorgar declared, his words carrying the weight of prophecy made manifest. "We will be the architects of humanity's golden age, not built upon the ruins of our enemies, but upon the foundation of our own greatness, finally allowed to flourish without external corruption." As the council concluded, and the Primarchs prepared to take their first steps into the galaxy that awaited them, the Emperor felt a satisfaction that went beyond mere pride in his genetic creations. He had succeeded not just in creating 20 superhuman generals, but in preserving their potential to become what he had always intended them to be, leaders worthy of guiding humanity toward a future brighter than any that had seemed possible under the shadow of chaos. The Great Crusade would begin soon, but it would be a crusade of hope rather than desperation, of construction rather than merely destruction, of unification achieved through demonstrated superiority of purpose rather than imposed through superior firepower. The galaxy awaited, and for the first time in 60 million years, that waiting carried the promise of genuine peace rather than merely the absence of open war. 20 suns had awakened to their destiny, and with them, humanity's true golden age was about to begin. Chapter 10. First Contact Protocol. The first expedition fleet of the transformed Great Crusade departed Terra's orbital dockyards on a day when the warp flows ran clearer than they had in 60 million years. Where once the Imperium's expansion would have required massive battle fleets designed to break the resistance of corrupted worlds, now sleek exploration vessels led formations that spoke more of diplomatic missions than military conquest. The ships themselves reflected this new purpose, their hulls bearing not just the aquilar of imperial authority, but the olive branches and open hands that had become symbols of humanity's desire for peaceful unification. Horus commanded the flagship Vengeful Spirit, though the vessel had been significantly modified from its original warlike configuration. Additional diplomatic facilities occupied space that might once have housed torpedo bays, while cultural analysis laboratories replaced bombardment planning chambers. The War Master's first expedition target was not chosen for its strategic value or resource potential, but for the opportunity it represented to test the new protocols of contact and integration. The world of 6319 had been listed in Imperial records as a lost colony that had fallen out of contact during the Age of Strife. Long-range astropathic detection suggested a thriving human population that had not only survived the dark millennia, but had actually prospered, developing into a sophisticated civilization that maintained both technological advancement and social stability. It was, in many ways, the perfect test case for the new model of imperial expansion. As the expedition fleet emerged from the warp at the system's edge, the differences from traditional conquest patterns became immediately apparent. Rather than advancing directly to orbital positions where they could threaten the world below, the ships maintained defensive formations at a respectful distance while transmitting carefully crafted messages of greeting and peaceful intent. The first contact protocols developed by the awakened Primarchs emphasized patience over speed, understanding over domination. "Citizens of the world you call home," Horus spoke into the transmission arrays, his words carrying across the void with the weight of absolute sincerity. "I am Horus Lupercal, son of the Emperor of Mankind, commander of this expedition fleet. We come not as conquerors but as brothers, seeking to reunite the scattered children of Terra under the banner of shared humanity. We request the honor of diplomatic contact, that we might speak as equals about the future we could build together. The response, when it came after several hours of presumably urgent consultation among the world's leadership, carried a mixture of wonder and cautious hope that would have been impossible in a galaxy still shadowed by chaos corruption. The planetary governor, a woman named Thessarian Morrow, spoke with the careful dignity of someone who had never expected to face such a momentous decision. We greet you, Horus Lupercal, and through you the distant world from which our ancestors came. We have maintained the records and the memories, though we had long since ceased to expect contact with Terra. If you truly come in peace, we welcome the opportunity for dialogue. Yet we must know, what would reunion with the Imperium mean for our world and our people? The question opened precisely the kind of substantive diplomatic discussion that the new protocols were designed to facilitate, rather than the ultimatums and demands for immediate compliance that had characterized the original Crusade plans. Horus found himself engaged in genuine negotiation with leaders who had every right to question what imperial unification would mean for their sovereignty and way of life. Over the course of several days, delegations from both sides met in neutral space aboard specially configured vessels that had been designed to facilitate exactly this kind of cultural exchange. The representatives of 6319 proved to be sophisticated negotiators who had maintained many of the philosophical and ethical traditions of ancient Terra, while developing their own unique approaches to governance and social organization. The breakthrough came when Magnus arrived with the second wave of the expedition fleet, his psychic abilities allowing him to demonstrate the transformed nature of the warp itself. Where once such a display might have terrified colonial populations familiar with the dangers of uncontrolled psychic phenomena, now Magnus could show them visions of clean, purposeful energy that served human advancement rather than threatening it. The barriers that once made unity impossible have been removed, Magnus explained to the assembled colonial delegation, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. The warp storms that isolated your world from Terra, the psychic predators that made long-range communication dangerous, the corrupting influences that turned cooperation into conquest, all of these have been eliminated. We offer not subjugation, but true partnership in building something greater than any human civilization has achieved before. The integration of 6319 into the expanding Imperium became a model for the expeditions that followed. Rather than replacing the world's government with imperial administrators, the agreement established a federal relationship that preserved local autonomy while providing access to imperial resources and technology. The planet's unique innovations in sustainable agriculture and social organization became part of the growing corpus of human knowledge, while its population gained access to the broader community of human worlds that the Great Crusade was gradually reuniting. Yet perhaps the most significant development came when the expedition encountered their first non-human civilization. The Interrex had once been targeted for potential extermination based on the assumption that any alien influence was inherently corrupting. Yet in a galaxy freed from chaos taint, the relationship between humans and the sophisticated aliens who had become their partners presented an entirely different set of considerations. The Interrex delegation that met with Horus and his diplomatic corps was led by beings whose approach to philosophy and governance showed remarkable parallels to the best of human civilization. More importantly, their society had clearly benefited from the elimination of chaos influence just as human worlds had, developing along lines that emphasized cooperation and mutual advancement rather than the suspicious isolation that had once characterized interspecies relations. "We have watched the transformation of the galaxy with great interest," the Interex spokesman declared, his words translated through technology that both civilizations had developed to facilitate communication. "The removal of the corrupting influences that once made cooperation impossible has created opportunities that neither of our species could achieve alone. We propose not conquest or subordination, but genuine alliance in exploring what the galaxy might become when its peoples work together toward common purposes." The negotiations that followed established precedents that would reshape the very nature of imperial expansion. Rather than the human supremacist doctrine that had originally been planned, the new imperium began to develop as a more complex organization that could accommodate different species and civilizations as long as they shared certain fundamental values about the dignity of conscious beings and the importance of cooperative advancement. Gilliman's expedition to the Ultramar sector demonstrated how these new principles could be applied on a larger scale. Rather than conquering the 500 worlds through military might, his forces served as facilitators and advisors in a process of voluntary confederation that preserved the unique characteristics of each member world while binding them together through shared institutions and common purpose. "We offer not the replacement of your traditions, but their elevation," Gilliman explained to the assembled delegates from across the sector. "Imperial unity means access to the knowledge and resources of every human world, the protection that comes from shared defense, and the opportunities that emerge when different approaches to human advancement can learn from each other." The success of these early diplomatic expansions began to attract attention from human worlds that had not yet been contacted by imperial expeditions. Reports of peaceful integration and mutual benefit spread through the improving astropathic networks, creating a phenomenon that no one had anticipated: human colonies actively seeking contact with imperial forces rather than hiding from them. Dawn's expedition to the fortified worlds of the Inwit cluster found planets that had already begun preparing for integration based on reports from successful diplomatic contacts elsewhere, rather than the siege warfare that might have been necessary to crack their defensive systems. His forces found themselves welcomed as liberators who could finally offer connection to the broader human community without the threat of conquest or forced compliance. The transformation extended beyond human-to-human relations to encompass the galaxy's entire strategic balance. Alien civilizations that had once been automatically classified as threats began to be evaluated according to their actual behavior and intentions rather than their species membership. Many proved to be potential allies, or at least neutral neighbors, whose own development had benefited from the elimination of chaos corruption. The Eldari craft world that made contact with Vulcan's expedition provided perhaps the most dramatic example of how the transformed galaxy was reshaping interspecies relations. Rather than the mutual hostility that had once characterized human Eldari encounters, the meeting led to productive exchanges of technology and philosophy that benefited both civilizations. "We have long watched your species with a mixture of hope and dread," the Eldari Farseer explained through translation protocols that had been rapidly developed to facilitate the unprecedented diplomatic contact. "Your potential for greatness was always evident, yet the corrupting influences that plagued your development made cooperation too dangerous to contemplate. Now, with those influences removed, we see opportunities for partnership that could benefit all the galaxy's peoples." As the Great Crusade progressed through its first years, patterns emerged that would have been impossible under the shadow of chaos corruption. Worlds joined the Imperium voluntarily after observing the benefits that integration brought to their neighbors. Alien civilizations sought diplomatic contact rather than fleeing or preparing for war. Technology and knowledge flowed freely between member worlds, accelerating advancement across all sectors of human space. Yet the most significant development was the gradual emergence of genuinely representative governance within the expanding imperium. The Council of Terra was restructured to include representatives from integrated colonial worlds, creating a legislative body that could balance the Emperor's executive authority with the voices of the diverse populations that made up the new imperial community. The first session of the expanded council brought together delegates from dozens of worlds, each representing different approaches to human civilization that had developed during the long isolation of the Age of Strife. Rather than homogenizing these differences, the new imperial structure sought to preserve and learn from them, creating a federal system that was stronger for its diversity rather than weakened by it. "We gather not as subjects before a throne," the Emperor addressed the assembled delegates, "but as partners in building something unprecedented in galactic history, an empire that grows through attraction rather than conquest, that preserves diversity while building unity, that serves its people rather than demanding their service without consent." The Primarchs found their roles transformed as completely as the Crusade itself. Where they had been designed as generals leading armies of conquest, they became architect administrators, building the institutions and relationships that would sustain the expanding imperial community. Their enhanced abilities proved equally valuable in diplomacy and construction, as they had originally been intended for warfare and destruction. As the 10th year of the transformed Great Crusade approached, reports reached Terra of successes that surpassed even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. Hundreds of human worlds had joined the Imperium through peaceful integration. Dozens of alien civilizations had established productive relationships with the imperial institutions. The galaxy itself seemed to be awakening to possibilities that had been dormant for millions of years. Yet perhaps the most remarkable development was what did not occur. There were no rebellions against imperial authority, no chaos cults rising to corrupt integrated worlds, no alien threats that required genocidal responses. The galaxy had not become perfect. There were still conflicts, disagreements, and challenges that required careful negotiation, but it had become fundamentally different from the perpetual war zone that most had expected. Standing before the great windows of the imperial palace, looking out at stars that now represented partners rather than conquest targets, the Emperor contemplated the success of the gamble that had begun with his war against the Chaos Gods. The Great Crusade was proceeding exactly as it should, in a galaxy freed from corruption. Not as a tide of conquest washing over helpless worlds, but as a growing community of conscious beings working together toward futures that none could achieve alone. The dream of human unity was becoming reality, but it was proving to be a richer and more complex reality than anyone had originally envisioned. The Great Crusade was not ending humanity's isolation, but revealing that they had never been as alone as they had believed. In freeing the galaxy from chaos, they had discovered a universe full of potential friends and partners, all working together toward a golden age that was no longer merely a distant hope, but an approaching reality. Chapter 11. The Eldar's Gratitude. The approach of Craftworld Ulthwé toward the Sol system was detected by Imperial astropaths 3 days before the massive vessel emerged from the webway at the edge of Terran space. The psychic signature that preceded it was unlike anything in recorded human experience, vast, ancient, and carrying undertones of grief so profound that several of the more sensitive psychers required medical attention after their brief contact with its emanations. Yet beneath that overwhelming sorrow lay something unprecedented in human Eldari relations, hope tempered by genuine gratitude. The Emperor felt the craft world's approach like the tolling of a bell across dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time. Standing in the great observatory atop the Imperial Palace, he watched as the alien vessel materialized in the void between Mars and Jupiter, a construct so vast that it dwarfed the largest ships in the Imperial fleet, its wraithbone hull singing with harmonics that resonated through the transformed warp like a psalm of mourning made manifest. Malkador joined him at the viewing station, the sigillite's ancient features showing strain that spoke of the psychic pressure radiating from the Eldari vessel. In all his millennia of service, he had never experienced contact with a civilization whose psychic presence was so overwhelming, yet so carefully controlled. The craft world's approach represented not a threat, but a formal overture conducted according to protocols that predated human civilization by millions of years. "They request formal audience," Malkador reported, his voice carrying undertones of wonder despite his vast experience with the impossible. The psychic transmission was sent in High Gothic, perfectly rendered and grammatically precise. They claimed to come not as conquerors or supplicants, but as grateful neighbors seeking to offer thanks for services rendered to all thinking beings in the galaxy. The Emperor's response carried the weight of one who had long anticipated this moment, though perhaps not in the form it was taking. "Arrange the meeting in the Sanctum Diplomaticus. Full ceremonial honors, but no weapons or aggressive displays. If the Eldari have come to offer gratitude rather than ultimatums, we will receive them with the dignity their gesture deserves." The delegation that descended from Craftworld Ulthwé was led by a figure whose very presence seemed to bend reality around itself. Farsia Taldir moved with the fluid grace that characterized her species, yet her bearing carried authority that spoke of one who had guided her people through crisis after crisis during the long centuries since their empire's fall. Her armor was not the practical ceramite of human war gear, but living bone that had been shaped by techniques that predated the oldest human legends. The Sanctum Diplomaticus had been prepared according to protocols that acknowledged both species' needs and sensitivities. The chamber's architecture avoided the harsh angles that might have seemed aggressive to Eldari perception, while maintaining the formal dignity that imperial ceremony required. Psychic dampeners had been carefully calibrated to prevent accidental mental contact while allowing for the telepathic communication that the Eldari might require. As the Emperor entered the chamber, his golden radiance seemed to resonate with the Farseer's psychic aura in ways that created harmony rather than discord. The meeting that followed would be recorded in the histories of both civilizations as the moment when two of the galaxy's greatest powers chose cooperation over the mutual suspicion that had characterized their previous encounters. "Emperor of mankind," Farsia Taldir spoke, her words carrying harmonics that existed in dimensions beyond mere sound. "I come before you, not as a representative of a species that has often been your enemy, but as one who speaks for all those who have benefited from actions that few could have contemplated, fewer still could have achieved." The Emperor's response was measured, carrying acknowledgement of both the Farseer's dignity and the historic significance of her presence on Terra. "Farseer of Ulthwé, you are welcome in our halls. Your people are known to us as ancient and wise, though our histories speak more of conflict than cooperation. If you come offering a different future, we are prepared to listen." What followed was a revelation that recontextualized not only the Emperor's war against the Chaos Gods, but the entire trajectory of galactic history. The Farseer spoke of the Eldari Empire's final centuries, when their civilization had descended into such extremes of sensation and experience that they had inadvertently given birth to the youngest of the Chaos Gods. Slanesh's awakening had consumed not just the Eldari homeworlds, but the souls of nearly an entire species, leaving only scattered survivors fleeing in craft worlds and hidden refuges. The Prince of Pleasure was born from our excess, Taldir acknowledged, her words carrying the weight of species-wide guilt that had shaped Eldari culture for millennia. Our empire's fall fed its birth, and its hunger for Eldari souls has driven us to the edge of extinction ever since. Yet when you entered the realm of chaos and bound that which we had created, you gave our people something we had not possessed since our empire's end, the possibility of a future that extends beyond mere survival. The Emperor's understanding of the implications was immediate and profound. By binding Slanesh, rather than destroying the youngest Chaos God, he had not merely removed a threat to human expansion, but had lifted a death sentence that had hung over the Eldari species since their empire's collapse. The gratitude that had driven Craftworld Ulthwé to approach Terra was not mere diplomatic courtesy, but genuine acknowledgement of species-level salvation. Your binding of She Who Thirsts was not the end of our liberation, the Farseer continued, her psychic presence beginning to project images that illustrated the scope of transformation across the galaxy. The death of Khorne has ended the endless cycle of violence that fed upon itself across the stars. The destruction of Nurgle has broken the stagnation that trapped so many civilizations in cycles of decay they could not escape. The elimination of Tzeentch has stabilized the currents of change itself, allowing progress without the corruption of purpose that once made advancement dangerous. The visions that accompanied her words showed worlds across the galaxy where the effects of the Emperor's victory were becoming apparent. Eldari craft worlds whose populations were beginning to grow rather than merely survive. Alien civilizations that had been trapped in patterns of self-destruction for millennia, suddenly finding paths toward genuine advancement. Even the Orc populations, freed from the psychic pressure that had driven them to endless warfare, beginning to develop more complex societies that channeled their aggressive instincts toward construction rather than destruction. We come to offer more than gratitude, Farseer Taldir declared, as the visions faded and the chamber returned to its normal configuration. The Eldari possess a knowledge and technologies that could serve the expansion of civilization across the galaxy. In recognition of the service you have performed, not just for our species, but for all thinking beings, Craftworld Ulthwé offers alliance and partnership in building a future none of us could achieve alone. The technologies that the Eldari delegation offered as symbols of their gratitude represented advancement that could accelerate imperial development by millennia. Wraithbone construction techniques that could create living architecture responsive to inhabitants' needs. Psychic disciplines that could safely harness the energies of the transformed warp without risk of corruption. Most significantly, access to the webway itself, the ancient network of tunnels through space that could allow instantaneous travel across the galaxy without exposure to the dangers that still lurked in real space. Yet perhaps the most valuable gift was knowledge itself. The Eldari had observed galactic civilization for millions of years, accumulating understanding of threats and opportunities that human science was only beginning to discover. Their warnings about extragalactic dangers that still approached the galaxy's edges provided strategic intelligence that could shape imperial expansion for millennia to come. Beyond the galactic rim, Farseer Taldir explained, as hololithic displays showed the movements of vast biofleets in the void between galaxies. Hunger approaches that knows no satisfaction. The great devourer comes to consume worlds and souls alike, though its arrival remains centuries in the future. Your victory over the Chaos Gods has eliminated one set of existential threats, but others remain that will require preparation on a scale that no single species can achieve. The strategic implications of the Eldari warnings began to reshape imperial planning, even as the formal alliance was being negotiated. The Great Crusade's peaceful expansion would need to accelerate not just to reunite human worlds, but to build the galactic civilization that would be necessary to face threats that dwarfed even the Chaos Gods in their destructive potential. The formal treaty signed between the Imperium and Craftworld Ulthwé established precedents that would guide interspecies relations for millennia. Rather than the human supremacist doctrine that had originally been planned, the agreement acknowledged the Eldari as equal partners in a galactic confederation that could include any species committed to the advancement of conscious life against the forces that sought its destruction. Joint expeditions began within months of the treaty's signing, with Eldari farseers serving alongside Imperial commanders in reclaiming maiden worlds that had been abandoned during their empire's fall. The combination of human determination and Eldari wisdom proved remarkably effective in restoring worlds whose ecosystems had been waiting for millennia for their intended inhabitants to return. The webway portal that the Eldari constructed beneath the Imperial Palace represented the most significant technological advancement in human history. The carefully shielded tunnel through dimensions that existed parallel to real space provided access to travel times that made the warp routes seem primitive by comparison. More importantly, it demonstrated the kind of cooperation that could be achieved when species that had once been enemies discovered common purpose in facing greater challenges. Magnus proved particularly adept at learning the psychic disciplines that the Eldari shared with their new allies. His natural talent for manipulating the energies of the warp translated readily to the more sophisticated techniques that the Eldari had developed over millions of years of practice. Under Farseer Taldir's guidance, he began to develop abilities that combined human innovation with Eldari wisdom in ways that surpassed what either species could have achieved alone. The barriers between species are constructs of fear and misunderstanding, Magnus reported to the expanded Council of Terra during one of the sessions that now included Eldari representatives. When those barriers are removed, the potential for advancement increases exponentially. What we are building together exceeds the sum of our individual capabilities. Yet even as the alliance flourished and joint expeditions achieved successes that surpassed all projections, the Eldari brought warnings that tempered celebration with sobering awareness of challenges yet to come. The destruction of 3 Chaos Gods and the binding of the 4th had indeed eliminated the greatest immediate threats to galactic civilization, but it had also created a vacuum that other forces might seek to fill. The great game of the warp continues, even without the major players that once dominated it, Farseer Taldir warned during one of the strategic planning sessions that had become regular features of Imperial Eldari cooperation. Lesser entities that were once insignificant compared to the Chaos Gods may grow to fill the void their absence has created. New threats may emerge from the spaces between dimensions that we have not yet learned to monitor. The prophecies that the Eldari shared spoke of transformations still to come, changes in the fundamental nature of existence that would be driven by the very success of the Emperor's victory over chaos. The galaxy was entering uncharted territory, following a path that no civilization had ever traveled before. The alliance between human and Eldari knowledge would be crucial in navigating the challenges that such unprecedented transformation would inevitably bring. As the first year of formal alliance drew to a close, the Emperor stood once again in the Great Observatory, watching as ships bearing both human and Eldari crew departed for joint missions across the galaxy. The transformation that had begun with his war against the Chaos Gods was continuing to spread, creating possibilities that no single being could have envisioned. The gratitude of the Eldari had become something greater than mere acknowledgement of past service. It had become the foundation for cooperation that was reshaping the very nature of galactic civilization. Yet with that cooperation came responsibility, the obligation to prove worthy of the trust that even ancient enemies had been willing to place in the vision of a galaxy united in purpose rather than divided by fear. The Great Crusade continued, but it had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a cooperative effort involving multiple species working together toward futures that none could achieve alone. It was perhaps the first true step toward the Golden Age that had always been more hope than expectation. Yet the warnings remained, and the challenges ahead would test whether the alliance forged in gratitude could endure the trials that prophecy suggested were yet to come. Chapter 12. The Golden Age begins. 2 centuries had passed since the last Chaos God fell silent, and terror itself bore witness to transformation that surpassed even the Emperor's most optimistic visions. Where once the cradle world had struggled to support a few billion souls scraping existence from poisoned soil, now garden cities stretched between gleaming spires that housed populations that numbered in the tens of billions. The sky above was clear of the perpetual smog that had characterized the planet for millennia, while oceans that had once run red with chemical pollutants now sparkled beneath suns whose light was no longer filtered through layers of industrial waste. The Emperor walked through the transformed landscape of his home world, his consciousness taking in changes that reflected not mere recovery, but genuine renaissance. Children played in parks where ancient battlefields had once claimed millions of lives. Scholars debated philosophy in amphitheaters built upon the ruins of hive city slums. Artists created works of beauty that drew inspiration from hope rather than desperation. It was everything that the Great Crusade had been intended to achieve, yet the price of that achievement remained a question that haunted his thoughts as surely as the whispers of chaos once had. Reports from across the galaxy painted similar pictures of unprecedented prosperity and advancement. The Primarchs had indeed become the philosopher kings that their genetic programming had always intended them to be, each governing sectors of space that had grown into exemplars of human civilization. Horus administered trade networks that spanned thousands of star systems with efficiency that eliminated scarcity without destroying initiative. Gilliman had created governmental structures that balanced individual liberty with collective purpose in ways that previous civilizations had only theorized about. Dawn had built defenses that protected not just territory, but the very ideals that made defending it worthwhile. Yet as the Emperor reviewed the data streams that chronicled humanity's golden age, he found himself contemplating questions that had no easy answers. The generation that was coming of age across imperial space had never known the desperate struggle that had once defined human existence. They had been born into a galaxy where cooperation was more common than conflict, where technological advancement served life rather than merely enabling survival, where the greatest challenges were philosophical rather than existential. Magnus approached through the garden paths that wound between flowering trees whose genetic templates combined Terran heritage with innovations discovered on a dozen worlds. The Primarch's enhanced consciousness no longer burned with the desperate hunger for knowledge that had once driven him toward forbidden lore. Instead, his psychic abilities served the careful cultivation of wisdom that could be shared rather than hoarded, understanding that could elevate rather than corrupt. "Father," Magnus spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions that had once been filled with the laughter of dark gods. The quarterly reports from the frontier expeditions have arrived. The news is complex. The Emperor gestured toward a pavilion where they could speak privately, surrounded by architecture that had been grown rather than built using techniques that the Eldari Alliance had made possible. The structure itself seemed to listen to their conversation, its living walls adjusting acoustics to ensure that their words would reach no ears but their own. "Tell me of the complexities," the Emperor commanded, settling into a chair that molded itself to his form while maintaining the dignity that such conversations required. Magnus activated hololithic displays that showed the current extent of imperial expansion, a sphere of influence that encompassed nearly half the galaxy's habitable worlds through peaceful integration and voluntary confederation. Yet at the edges of that expansion, new challenges were beginning to emerge that would test whether the cooperative civilization they had built could face threats that existed beyond the reach of diplomacy. The deep-range exploration fleets have detected massive biosignatures approaching the galaxy from the intergalactic void, Magnus reported, his psychic senses interpreting data that conventional sensors could only begin to comprehend. The entities show characteristics that suggest directed intelligence, yet their patterns of movement indicate purposes that may be fundamentally incompatible with any form of sentient life we have encountered. The Tyranids. The Emperor had anticipated their eventual arrival, based on the warnings that the Eldari Alliance had provided, yet seeing confirmation of their approach created concerns that went beyond mere military preparedness. The Great Devourer represented a threat that could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or converted to purposes that served life rather than consumption. For the first time since the fall of the Chaos Gods, humanity faced an enemy that would require responses that their peaceful expansion had not been designed to provide. "How long before they reach the galactic edge?" the Emperor asked, his mind already beginning to calculate the resources and strategies that would be necessary to face an enemy that viewed all biological matter as nothing more than raw material for their own expansion. "Current trajectory analysis suggests first contact within 3 centuries, Magnus replied. "Sufficient time to prepare defenses and develop countermeasures, but also enough time for complacency to develop among populations that have never faced existential threat." "The irony is not lost on me, Father. In creating the peaceful galaxy you envisioned, we may have also created a civilization that lacks the desperate edge that once drove human achievement." The observation struck at the heart of concerns that had been growing in the Emperor's mind as the Golden Age matured. The humans who were coming of age in the transformed galaxy possessed capabilities that surpassed their ancestors in every measurable way. They were healthier, longer-lived, more educated, more capable of cooperation and advanced reasoning. Yet they were also, perhaps inevitably, softer than the generations that had been forged in the crucible of perpetual struggle against corruption and extinction. Their conversation was interrupted by a subtle fluctuation in the psychic atmosphere around them, a disturbance that spoke of stress in bonds that had remained stable for 2 centuries. The Emperor's enhanced senses immediately identified the source. The prison of golden light where Slaanesh remained bound was showing signs of strain. The youngest Chaos God was growing stronger despite his captivity, learning from his imprisonment in ways that might eventually allow him to break free. "The binding weakens," the Emperor acknowledged, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would eventually have to be made. "Slaanesh was bound rather than destroyed because I believed that the drives he represented, the pursuit of perfection, the appreciation of beauty, the desire for transcendent experience, were necessary aspects of human nature that required guidance rather than elimination. Yet his continued existence remains a threat that will only grow with time. Magnus studied the psychic emanations that flickered around the distant binding chamber, his enhanced perceptions analyzing patterns of power that would have been invisible to unaugmented senses. The question becomes whether the galaxy we have built is strong enough to contain him if he breaks free, or wise enough to channel his influence toward purposes that serve life rather than enslaving it. The humans of this age have never faced such temptation. They may prove more vulnerable to seduction than their ancestors, who had been hardened by constant struggle. The implications extended beyond the immediate threat of Slanesh's potential escape. The Emperor's victory over chaos had been predicated on the assumption that humanity could develop the wisdom and strength to face future challenges without the constant pressure of existential threat. Yet 2 centuries of peace had begun to raise questions about whether such wisdom could be cultivated in the absence of the very struggles that had once made it necessary. They walked together through the palace corridors toward the great communications center, where reports from across the galaxy arrived in constant streams. The data that flowed through the webway network painted pictures of civilizations that had achieved levels of prosperity and advancement that previous ages could never have imagined. Yet embedded within those achievements were subtle signs of spiritual drift, of populations that had grown so comfortable with peace that they had begun to lose sight of the values that peace was meant to protect. The Webway project itself stood as perhaps the greatest achievement of the transformed galaxy. The network of tunnels through dimensional space that connected every major imperial world had been completed through cooperation between human engineering and Eldari wisdom, creating a transportation system that made the old warp routes seem primitive by comparison. Ships could traverse the galaxy in days rather than months, while the risk of corruption or loss that had once made space travel a desperate gamble had been reduced to negligible levels. Yet even this triumph carried its own complexities. The ease of travel and communication that the Webway provided had begun to homogenize cultures that had once been shaped by their isolation and unique challenges. The diversity of human civilization that had once been its greatest strength was gradually being smoothed away by constant contact and cultural exchange. Captain General Valdor met them at the entrance to the communications center, his ageless features showing concern that spoke of reports that required immediate attention. The leader of the Custodian Guard had overseen the transformation of his forces from palace protectors to guardians of a galactic civilization. Yet his enhanced awareness detected patterns of change that required careful monitoring. "My lord, we have received troubling reports from the frontier worlds," Valdor announced, his voice carrying the weight of one who had seen civilizations rise and fall across the centuries. Several colonies report incidents of what can only be described as spiritual malaise. Populations that have achieved material prosperity, but find themselves questioning the meaning and purpose of their achievements. The phenomenon was not entirely unexpected. The Emperor had long understood that human nature required challenge and struggle to maintain its edge, that the very difficulties that had once threatened to destroy the species had also served to define its character and drive its advancement. In removing those challenges, he had also removed some of the forces that had shaped humanity's greatest achievements. "Summon the Primarchs," the Emperor commanded. "It is time to consider what adjustments may be necessary to preserve the essential character of our civilization while maintaining the peace and prosperity that we have achieved." The council that convened in the great strategic chamber represented a gathering of minds that had been shaped by unprecedented success, yet faced challenges that success itself had created. Each Primarch brought reports from their own sectors that painted similar pictures of civilizations that had achieved their material goals, but struggled to find new purposes that could drive continued advancement. Lorgar spoke of worlds where spiritual seeking had been redirected away from the dark gods that no longer existed, yet had not found satisfying replacements for the transcendent purpose that religious conviction could provide. Without the threat of damnation to drive them toward salvation, he observed, many populations have begun to treat existence itself as purpose enough. Yet human nature requires more than mere existence to achieve its full potential. The Khan reported similar patterns among populations that had been freed from the constant warfare that had once shaped their cultures. The warrior spirit that drove human expansion across the stars has been channeled into peaceful competition and artistic expression, he noted. Yet something essential may have been lost in that transformation. The edge that comes from knowing that failure carries genuine consequences. As the discussion continued, patterns emerged that would require careful consideration in planning humanity's continued development. The golden age that had been achieved was genuine and unprecedented, yet it had also revealed aspects of human nature that required challenge and struggle to maintain their vitality. The question became how to preserve the essential drives that had made the species great while maintaining the peace that allowed that greatness to flourish. The Emperor's response reflected the wisdom of one who had guided humanity through countless challenges, yet faced his greatest test in the management of unprecedented success. We must create new forms of meaningful challenge that serve advancement rather than merely survival, he declared. The tyrannid threat will provide external pressure that may restore some of the edge that peace has softened. Yet we must also develop internal sources of motivation that can drive human achievement without requiring existential desperation. As the council concluded, and the Primarchs prepared to implement strategies that would prepare their sectors for the challenges to come, the Emperor found himself walking alone through the palace corridors, where his journey toward this golden age had begun. The transformation of the galaxy had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, yet it had also created responsibilities and challenges that would require constant vigilance to manage. In the deep chambers where Slaanesh remained bound, the prison of golden light pulsed with energies that spoke of growing pressure against bonds that might not hold forever. The Prince of Pleasure was learning patience in his captivity, discovering subtleties of seduction and corruption that his previous existence had never required. When he eventually broke free, and the Emperor harbored few illusions that such freedom could be prevented indefinitely, he would face a galaxy that had known 2 centuries of peace, populations that had never been tested against the kind of temptation that the youngest Chaos God represented. The question that haunted the Emperor's thoughts as he stood before the viewing windows that looked out upon the stars was whether his victory had ultimately strengthened humanity or weakened it. The species had achieved prosperity, longevity, technological advancement, and cooperative civilization on a scale that no previous age had imagined possible. Yet in removing the struggles that had forged their ancestors' character, he had also removed some of the forces that had made those ancestors capable of achieving the impossible. Standing alone in the chambers where he had once planned the destruction of gods, the Emperor contemplated the eternal paradox of success, that achieving one's goals inevitably created new challenges that success itself had made necessary. The galaxy awaited whatever decisions he would make about humanity's future. Yet for the first time in his long existence, he found himself uncertain whether the path forward led toward greater glory or inevitable decline. The Golden Age had begun, but with it came questions that would define the character of everything that followed. In saving humanity from the darkness, Had he also saved them from the struggle that had made them capable of greatness? Only time would provide the answer, and time was a luxury that even the master of a galaxy couldn't command. The stars beckoned with promise and threat in equal measure, and the Emperor prepared to meet whatever challenges they would bring.